You wake just before dawn, the air still cool and heavy with the soft mist that clings low to the ground between the rows of grapevines. The sky above Burgundy is a pale slate, slowly lightening as the first pale fingers of sunlight stretch over the horizon. You breathe deeply, the scent of damp earth and dew-laden leaves filling your nostrils. Around you, the vineyard lies quiet, except for the occasional rustle of a breeze through the vines and the distant call of a waking bird. Your feet touch the cold, uneven soil as you step from your modest sleeping quarters, a small wooden cabin near the edge of the fields. The earth feels soft beneath your worn boots, still moist from last night's gentle rain. You pull your cloak tighter about your shoulders, the chill reminding you of the season's shift as harvest approaches. There is a calm in this early hour, a pause before the day's labor begins. The rows of vines stand patiently, heavy with ripe clusters of grapes waiting to be gathered. You run your hand over a leaf, its surface cool and slightly sticky with morning dew. The work ahead will be steady, demanding, and filled with the familiar rhythms of vineyard life. But for now, you savor this quiet moment, the soft light, and the muted sounds of a world just waking. Historically, in 17th century Burgundy, grape harvests often began at dawn to take advantage of the cooler temperatures, which helped preserve the fruit's freshness before pressing. Some pickers believed that starting in heavy fog produced better wine, thinking the damp air kept the grapes calm before pressing. Historians still argue whether this early start was primarily practical or held ritual significance among the workers. You reach for a cluster of grapes, the sun still low but beginning to warm the air ever so slightly. Each bunch is heavy, swollen with juice, the deep purples and dusty blues almost glowing against the bright green leaves. Your fingers brush over the smooth skins, some still glistening with dew, others matte with the fine powdery bloom that nature leaves behind. The scent is sweet and earthy, a fragrant promise of the wine to come. Carefully, you grasp the stem and snap it clean from the vine, mindful not to bruise the fruit. Your hands soon become stained purple, a badge of the day's labor. The harvest is a slow, deliberate task, each bunch chosen for ripeness, avoiding those too green or already shriveled. Nearby, others work alongside you, their baskets gradually filling with the heavy fruit. The sound of soft voices and the rustling of leaves mingle with the occasional laughter or sigh. The sun rises steadily, spilling gold across the vineyard and casting long shadows behind the vines. You can feel the warmth spreading through your cloak, the morning chill giving way to the soft heat of early autumn. The air is thick with the mingled smells of earth, grape, and the faint aroma of wild herbs that grow between the rows. Picking grapes is a sensory experience: smooth skins, sticky juice, the weight of the fruit in your hands, the scents that rise with every movement. This slow harvest connects you to the earth and to generations before who have worked these same fields under the same skies. Historically, grape pickers in Burgundy paid close attention to the ripeness and condition of each bunch to ensure the best wine quality. Some workers held superstitions about certain rows producing better grapes, attributing differences to soil spirits or past harvests. Scholars still debate how much such beliefs influence the harvest timing and selection versus practical experience. With your basket now heavy with ripe grapes, you begin the slow walk back toward the press. The path beneath your feet is uneven, strewn with small stones and the occasional fallen leaf. Damp from the morning dew, you shift the basket carefully on your hip, feeling the weight tug downward, reminding you of the effort the vines have made to swell their fruit. The sun climbs steadily higher, warming your back and causing your breath to come a little quicker. Around you, the vineyard hums quietly with the day's rising energy. Other workers pass by carrying their own baskets, some balancing the loads on their heads, others with arms outstretched to steady the fruit. The chatter is subdued but familiar, punctuated by the occasional clatter of wooden tools or the soft creak of a cartwheel in the distance. Your hands, stained purple from the grape juice, grip the rough basket handle as you maneuver through the rows, mindful of not brushing against the thorny vine shoots or the thick leaves overhead. The scent of crushed grapes faintly lingers in the air, mingling with the warm earth and dry straw lining the edges of the paths. You pause briefly to wipe the sweat forming at your brow, tasting a trace of grape sweetness on your fingers. The rhythm of the vineyard is steady and old, a timeless pattern of work and rest. of sun and shadow. Historically, baskets used to carry grapes were often woven from willow or other flexible woods, sturdy enough to hold the heavy fruit, but light enough to carry for long hours. Some vineyards used small carts to move larger harvests, though many paths remained too narrow or uneven for wheels. Scholars still argue how widespread mechanized transport was in rural Burgundy during this period. You arrive at the wooden press, while the light is still soft enough to turn every edge of the oak a muted gold. The frame is massive, a patient creature of beams and pegs, squatting on its stone bed as if it has been waiting all night for your hands. You run your palm along the main crossbeam. It is smooth where years of shoulders have steadied themselves, rough where the grain rises, faintly sticky where last seasons must left a shy memory. The scent is layered old wine, wet wood, and a ghost of smoke left by last winter's fire. You begin with the simplest courtesies the press demands. You check the wedges that lock the uprights, tapping each with a mallet until the note settles in your chest. You test the thick cord slung around the capstan and the big screw. The fibers are slightly rough, grateful for a little attention. A scrap of linen comes out of your pocket, and you wipe the dust from the screw's threads where they rise like a patient staircase. Someone has rubbed a whisper of tallow along the thread, and the faint animal scent makes the old wood glide a little easier. The press stands under a simple roof of tiles, a roof that keeps most of the weather off, but lets in enough light that you do not feel trapped. The stone floor is swept, though press rooms are never perfectly tidy. A few skins from yesterday rest near the drain, and a stain the color of dusk wanders toward the trough. You lay your tools in a neat line, because order makes work go faster even when no one bothers to say it. A bucket of water waits at the edge, faintly metallic where it touched the ladle. You dip a finger, taste the clean metal tang, and let the drop fall back. You touch the collar that will sit on the cake of grapes, feeling the wood's weight as you lift it onto its pegs. The hoop is not elegant, but it is faithful. You check the staves that form the basket where the fruit will rest, each one swelling slightly at the middle like a well-fed monk. A loose dowel gets a firm push and behaves itself. When you step back, you see your morning stage set: beam, screw, basket, trough, and the waiting jars where the first must will fall. The jars are glazed a brown-green, their rims nicked by years of careful use. Others arrive, each with the look of someone who has decided to be awake, whether the world deserves it or not. A nod here, a small sound of greeting there, and the room fills with the small society of labor. A shoulder takes the far side of the capstan. A hand checks the pegs again. Someone brings in a fresh coil of rope that smells faintly of hemp and rain. You share a brief joke about the press's appetite, how it always wants more, and the laughter settles like dust, useful and unremarkable. There is nothing theatrical here, only the useful choreography that gets the day underway. You step to the screw and put your hands on the spokes. The first test turn is gentle, just enough to feel the threads bite and then slide, the wood answering with a patient growl. A bird chatters outside and stops. Even it seems to know this room is for listening. The slow circle of the capstan gathers the room into one motion. Your breath, their breath, the ring of the mallet on a wedge, the tiny click as a peg finds its seat. You do not rush the press. It does not reward rushing. It rewards respect with steady service and, when it feels magnanimous, mercy. The sun edges higher, lifting a small quilt of light across the floor. You move to the trough, trace the lip with a thumb, and raise your glance to the spout where the must will appear later. Shy at first, and then bold if all goes well. The cloths for straining are folded and ready, a small luxury earned by yesterday's careful washing. You tilt a jar to be sure no grit lies in the curve of its belly, then set it straight again. You could do this in the dark by touch alone. The tongue forgets, but the fingers never do. Between tasks, you pause for the quiet that keeps the day from turning into noise. You lean your back against the beam and feel its cool persistence through your shirt. Far off, a cartwheel complains. Closer by, a fly makes a ceremonial circuit of the roof beam and thinks better of intruding. You close your eyes for a breath. Accept the weight of your arms. Accept the small ache beginning where the capstan will grind its circle. And open your eyes again to the same room, unchanged and entirely sufficient. It is nearly time to load the grapes, but proper work begins with a final check. You set one foot on the stone base, try the screw again, and feel it move no more than a finger's width. But true. The wedges answer when tapped. The basket holds steady. The ropes carry their quiet promise from peg to peg. The jars wait with the patience of jars. For a brief moment, you allow yourself the smallest flourish or palm, smoothing the beam in a single long stroke, because ceremony, when it minds its manners, has a way of keeping hands honest. Historically, wine presses in 17th century Burgundy were commonly large oak screw or lever presses, tightened by capstan bars and secured with wedges to squeeze must from the loaded basket. A quirky habit, sometimes noted by workers, was to give the press a nickname or a quick tap on the beam for luck before the first turn, as if flattering a stubborn mule. Historians still argue how uniform these presses were across estates, whether most villages shared similar designs, or whether each cellar's press was a local invention patiently adjusted by memory. You tip the first basket onto a low wooden table and spread the clusters into a shallow drift, the way a careful cook levels flour with the back of a knife. The fruit settles with a soft shuffle, stems catching on stems, berries nudging berries. You pick up a small hook knife with a handle polished by other hands, and you begin the quiet housekeeping that makes later work behave itself. A leaf goes back to the earth. A withered berry is sent politely away. A brash twig is trimmed so it will not jab where it isn't invited. The routine is not glamorous, which suits it. Grapes reward the unglamorous better than most things. Your fingers learn today's particular language. The ripe clusters are heavy and relaxed, the light ones tight and fussy. Some are dappled from where sunlight slipped around leaves. Others are shaded, holding a cooler scent as if they saved the morning for you. You roll a bunch in your palm and feel the tiny crackle where the pedicels cling to the stem. One or two berries fall of their own accord and land with whispered sighs. You set them gently aside, because a grape that volunteers rarely wants to make trouble. A breeze reaches across the threshold and moves the skin of scent around your face. Sweet juice, dusty bloom, a shy mineral note from the stone floor. Somewhere, a fly decides to file an opinion and then forgets it. Your other hand keeps its steady rhythm. Lift, inspect, pinch away, lay down. A leaf with a pattern of chew marks earns a moment of attention, as does a small snail shell caught in a nest of stems. You pause to look at it. It is pretty, but not persuasive. Back to the ditch it goes. You build two careful piles, fruit that will move to the press, and things that will not. The first pile glows, a small landscape of blue-black and dusk purple. The second looks like the sweepings from a kindly broom. When a cluster is half perfect, you trim perfection's neighbors instead of breaking your stride. A little wisdom has accumulated in your hands over years. Do not pick fights with a vine's sense of design. It always wins on points. Sticky begins as a rumor on your fingertips and then becomes policy. Your knife remembers a few strands of pulp and pretends to be offended. A quick wipe on a strip of old linen soothes its temper. The table shows faint patches where last season's juice gave up its color to the grain. These stains are neither clean nor dirty, just honest. A ladle of water waits in a bucket. Not to wash the fruit, you do not fancy watering the wine, but to persuade tools and hands to relax their grip. You test each cluster with more than sight. You press the pad of your thumb against a berry until the skin says a soft hello, then release. You hold a whole bunch near your ear and give it the smallest shake. Ripe stems answer with a whisper that is not quite a rattle, not quite a sigh. You breathe on a cluster as if warming your hands in winter, and the bloom dulls under your breath, revealing the darker shine beneath. The little theatrics are not necessary, but they help your head slow to the correct tempo. At your side, a companion sorts in a similar rhythm. The two of you exchange the occasional commentary that passes for conversation during sorting. Bold leaf, you say, plucking a frilled offender. Likes attention, they reply, liberating a twig with the solemnity of a monk removing a pebble from a sandal. You share a half smile at the stem that insists on catching the same knot in the table plank, again and again, as if it woke with opinions. The work is repetitive and quiet, which is to say, agreeable. A few clusters come from younger vines, the stems greener, the scent a little brighter, the berries small but intent on being noticed. You set those aside for the later pressing, not unkindly, but because you prefer the older vines to speak first. When a bunch is more stem than fruit, you nip a few little bridges and let extra weight fall away. You do not strip the stems to the bone, you simply make sure you are not dragging a small thicket under the press. Stems can lend order to the cake so long as they remember their manners. Here and there, a wasp tests the proceedings with lazy entitlement. You ignore it when you can, and sweep it out with the corner of your sleeve when you must, the way you would move a drowsy cat from a chair. No one is trying to be brave. Everyone is trying not to be stung. The air near the doorway is brighter now, a warm rectangle that wanders across the floorboards as the sun thinks about climbing into its chair for the day. You keep your back to the light to see the shadows on the fruit. Flaws confess themselves to shade before they confess to glow. You take a handful of stems and crush them between your palms, testing their temper. They answer with a green, peppery smell that is pleasant in small quantities and bossy in large ones. You rub your hands again over the linen rag. Sticky has now become doctrine. It clings to the creases at your knuckles, to the shallow half-moon under each nail, to the unseen map of old tiny cuts. A drop of juice makes a clear path down your wrist and disappears into your sleeve, which takes this development with stoic grace. When the first table's work is done, the approved fruit sits in a shallow wicker basket lined with clean cloth. You lift the cloth's corners over the top and cradle it the way you might cradle a sleeping cat that pretends it dislikes you. A slow step carries it to a cool corner, away from direct sun, because patience is part of flavor, and heat likes to hurry things to disappointment. Back at the table, you begin again with the next basket, and the room returns to its favorite music low breaths, the small click of knife on wood, the tiny squeak where berry skins look for an excuse to be dramatic, and then think better of it. By mid-morning, the refuse pile gives off its own pale perfume, leafy and mild, with a hint of riverbank. The good fruit hums a riper tune, deeper, as if the sweetness has learned how to stand up without help. You roll your shoulders, feel the soft pull where the press spoke with you yesterday, and allow yourself a sip from the ladle. Water is water. It reminds you that the day is built from ordinary things behaving themselves. You finish a final pass with your palm, the way a mason wipes a stone to see if it will keep its promise, and you nod to the waiting press as if you and it have just exchanged a contract. The grapes are ready, not flattered, not forced, simply relieved of their distractions. The work ahead will be easier for it, and the juice, when it comes, will remember your courtesy. Historically, vineyard workers in 17th century Burgundy hand-sorted clusters to remove leaves, insects, and spoiled berries before pressing, and often trimmed or partially removed stems to temper the press cake and the wine's harshness. A quirky tidbit sometimes mentioned in cellar lore was the habit of tucking a sprig of thyme or a clean vine leaf under the sorting cloth to keep the must well-mannered, as if the herbs could teach etiquette. Historians still argue whether systematic destemming was common practice across Burgundy at this time or varied widely by estate, grape color, and local habit. You lift the lined basket with both hands and ease it into the press's slatted cage, the way you would settle a tired dog into its corner, no fuss, just gravity with manners. The clean cloth goes first, edges tucked against the staves so skins won't try their luck in the gaps. The fabric smells faintly of lye and yesterday's sun. Then the clusters follow in a soft cascade, a hush of berries and stems as they find their places. You level the first layer with your palm, smoothing fruit into the corners. Another basket comes in on a hip, and the rhythm arrives without ceremony. Pour, spread, smooth. Pour, spread, smooth. Stems brush your wrists, bloom dusts your knuckles in pale blue. A seed taps wood like a polite neighbor at a door. When a snag catches the cloth, you pinch the wrinkle flat and tuck it away, the way you'd convince a sheet to stop arguing with a mattress. The pile grows, calm, heavy, obedient in the slow way that good work is. You add a thin lattice of spare stems along the edges, nothing grand, just a modest scaffolding to keep the cake breathing when the caller asks it to learn grammar. You are not building a fence. You are reminding the fruit how to keep its shape. The lattice looks like a child's drawing of rails, which is to say, honest and effective. You nod to it, as if it could nod back, and carry on stacking fruit, with the patience of stone learning to be a wall. The trough below waits clean, the spout's lip wiped to a modest shine, and the first jar stands in its place with the posture of good pottery. A square of linen lies beside it like a folded promise to keep flies from writing their names in the must. A wasp drifts through the doorway, thinks better of its plans, and leaves the room to those who have business. You approve of its judgment without pausing your hands. Approval costs nothing and keeps the air mild. Near the top, you curate the final layer. The cleanest, ripest clusters deserve the honor, not for vanity's sake, but because the cloth will fold over them, and you prefer well-behaved fruit at the boundary. You check the fabric, no frayed threads, no small tears that would turn into epics when juice begins to look for exits. Corners fold in one by one, neat triangles that meet like four quiet arguments reaching agreement. Your palm presses the mound, and it gives a breath, then composes itself again. The wooden collar arrives in two careful hands. You share the weight and lower it over the folded cloth so each ear finds its peg. A dowel remembers it is loose and attempts drama. The mallet convinces it to reform. The collar sits true, neither proud on one side nor shy on the other. You run your hand around the rim and find the same story everywhere. Snug, even, willing. It is the plainest sort of satisfaction, which is the best kind for a long day. The capstan bars shine where they rest on their pegs, tempting, tools that think they are the story. You let them be. Their hour belongs to the next act. For now, your work belongs to gravity and arrangement. You lift the cloth at one corner and redirect a crease so it runs away from the spout rather than toward it. You trim a truculent stem pointing at the forbidden place. You tuck the last fold under the collar where no drip can mistake it for a road. You step back and regard the whole device as if you have never seen it. The cage is full but not greedy. The cloth lies quiet. The collar wears the expression of furniture that has decided to be useful. The beam above waits with the self-possession of old timber indifferent to your schedule, loyal to its own pace. You press the top lightly and feel the fruit breathe out a little, then settle as if it has remembered its upbringing. A companion arrives with a wicker tray of stems and asks, without speaking, whether you want them. You take a few and lay them crosswise, thin reminders that help the juice find paths instead of arguments. Another hand offers a clean vine leaf with the solemnity of a relic. You smile, set it atop the fold for luck, and move on. The room accepts the superstition with tolerant silence. The press, which has heard better jokes, remains impassive and therefore trustworthy. Sunlight leans higher outside, slipping a calm beam across the doorway. The press house keeps its shade and its quiet cool, the kind of cool that makes you feel competent by accident. You wipe your palms on the old linen that lives on the beam, then set it back in its customary drape. The jar is steady on the stone. The spout is clear. The floor is honest about last season's stains and this season's ambitions, and you are content to let honesty do the sweeping. You make one last circuit. Jar, spout, trough, collar, cloth, cage. Nothing wobbles, nothing sulks. A fly explores and chooses the door. The dog outside decides to be helpful by sleeping. You place your palm on the collar and give it a small, serious shake, the courtesy you grant a door, before trusting it with privacy. It does not rattle, and therefore you will. For a breath you stand still and let the room be a room. Beams that know their work, stone that survived other harvests, air that smells of readiness. The bar holes wait empty and will stay that way until the right moment. Your shoulders enjoy the last seconds of not turning anything. Your hands memorize where they will reach later, to pretend surprise. You nod to the beam like a neighbor you like well enough not to bother. Historically, 17th century presses in Burgundy commonly used cloth-lined, slatted cages loaded in layers, with a wooden collar set over folded cloth before the screw engaged. Workers often left a modest share of stems to keep the cake porous and drainage obedient once pressure began. A quirky bit of cellar habit recorded in local lore had some loaders placing a clean vine leaf atop the fold, so the press remembers summer, more comfort than seasoning. Historians still argue how widely stem retention and cloth lining were practiced across estates. You take your place at the capstan, as if greeting an old acquaintance who insists on the same jokes every year. The bars slide into their sockets with a dignified clunk, and four hands, yours and another pair, settle on the wood. You give the room a moment to fall quiet, then lean your shoulder and the circle begins. The first turn is not heroic. It is an introduction, a courteous reminder to the screw of what it was born to do. Threads bite with a slow, grainy whisper. The beam answers with a calm groan. The press does not hurry, because it has you for that. You move the bar one measured step at a time, feet finding their customary marks on the stone, breath coming in steady lengths. The cage lifts the barest hair inside the collar, and the folded cloth tightens like a well-tied apron. Somewhere under the wood, you feel the fruit reconsider its confidence. The cake draws a breath, and then another, as if the day has politely knocked and been allowed in. A seed pops faintly, the sound small but decisive. You trade places at the bar with a partner, each of you circling half the world before letting the other try the other half. The rhythm is dependable and a little vain. It enjoys being noticed, but behaves the same either way. The screw gives back exactly what you give it, plus the long patience of oak. You learn again how to pace yourself, for the press will not be bullied, and your shoulders have no useful arguments. Sweat finds your temples and then your jaw, a slow journey that is no trouble to anyone. The first drop of must gathers at the spout with a shy glitter, pretends to think about it, and then leaps. It lands in the jar with the smallest kiss of sound, a note so quiet you pretend you imagined it. Then another drop, then two at once, and soon a timid thread becomes an honest stream. The room meets the moment with the only celebration allowed in such places. Someone breathes out, someone else nods, and you keep turning. The scent climbs at once green and sweet, with a soft, sour edge like late morning apples. You call for a brief pause, no speech, just the bar settling back so the screw can think. The cake relaxes a finger's breadth, the way a stubborn book lies flatter when you look away. You listen the way you would listen to a dozing animal, for anything that is not quite right. Nothing protests. You tighten again, a quarter turn, and the flow strengthens, ticking into a thin, steady ribbon that braids itself in the jar. A crease in the cloth tries to be an event. You smooth it with the back of a knuckle. Around you, the small social matters proceed. A companion shifts the jars as they fill, exchanging the brimming one for a fresh soldier with a careful hand. A linen square covers the mouth. The trough is wiped when a drop misses its appointment. Another worker writes with a piece of chalk on a slate, nothing dramatic. Only the count of jars, so the day will remember itself later. The dog outside provides commentary by snoring. The screw soon grows heavy, not angry, only like a door with opinions. You accept the lesson and lean your weight in a more thorough way, keeping your back honest and your feet respectful of the stone. You pause again, as one does with any elder who has earned the courtesy of pauses. The cake settles another whisper lower. Somewhere inside it, skins press closer to skins, the stems make their small architecture count, and the juice decides to stop being shy. You dip a fingertip in the jar's flow and taste the must. It is brighter than the fruit in your palm, keen in the way morning is keen, with a hint of bitterness from the first squeeze that will tame itself later. You nod, which is the cellar's highest form of praise. You lift the full jar and set it beside its cousin, then reach for another brown-green glaze, the rim nicked in two ancient places, a friendly mouth that expects a quiet life and never receives one in harvest week. The capstan turns again. Your hands have found their steady truce with the grain, and the screw's thread rises and falls like a low hill as it passes under your touch. The flow is serene now, not eager, not tired. The cloth stays smooth under the collar. You press your palm lightly to the beam, the way one thanks a horse for remembering the road. The room is simple. Wood, stone, air, must, human breath, and time that has agreed to go slowly. You grant the cake a rest, a long breath, while you refill your own. In that stillness, the spout continues to mark seconds, drop by soft drop, as if time itself prefers to be measured in sweetness. The bar waits in its sockets and your shoulder loosens without permission. You stand, you look, you listen. A beam creaks, but in the voice you know, the voice that means working, not trouble. The jar rises toward fullness. You lower the linen and exchange it for an empty cousin. The slate receives another mark, back to the bar. Another steady circle. Another careful quarter turn. The stream thickens again, then eases, as the cake explains itself to you in fluent silence. You relieve the pressure a courteous step backward, so the fruit can reorganize its thoughts. then forward again. You think of nothing, and therefore of everything. The vines at dawn, the dust on the beam, the tiny seed that chose to declare itself, the first drop that pretended to hesitate and didn't. The world has narrowed to a wooden thread and a slow river of juice. Historically, wine growers in 17th century Burgundy used large wooden screw presses turned by capstan bars in measured stages, pausing between turns so the cake could settle and the must could flow more freely. The earliest, freely running juice was often collected separately as the finest portion. A quirky habit sometimes noted in cellar lore had workers counting each turn aloud or tapping the crossbeam for luck before the first real tightening, a way of coaxing cooperation from timber and grapes for luck. Historians still argue how systematically estates separated free run and press wine in this period, and how widely those staged pauses were taught versus learned by habit. You cradle the first jar as if it were a sleeping animal, the warm brown glaze catching a thin ribbon of light while the must descends from the spout. The liquid arrives shyly straw pale and clear-shouldered, then grows surer with every patient drop. You keep the mouth close to the stream so it will not chatter against the stone lip. What remains is the softest applause a day can offer. Beside you, a folded square of linen waits to become a cap, smelling faintly of soap and last week's sunshine. You tilt the jar a fraction so bubbles gather along one side, small moons rising and breaking in a quiet festival. A seed floats for the length of a sigh like a traveler who has misplaced the road, then sinks with the resignation of someone who knows the cellar's rules. You nod to the jar out of habit. Praise is wasted on pottery, but respect is not. The scent climbs green and floral, faintly peppered where stems remembered their manners, while a chalk-cool breath from the trough steadies everything. Another jar waits already, shoulder to shoulder with its cousin. You slide the full one aside and trade places with the empty, the way two dancers change partners without troubling the music. The linen square drops over the brimming mouth, a small tent to keep the day honest. You smooth the cloth with the same palm you use on the beam, not superstition, only the courtesy of touch. The full jar joins the growing line along the wall, the stone at its back as cool as intention. The stream brightens when the capstan earns another measured quarter turn. Nothing here is dramatic. Nothing in this house is but the ribbon fattens, the smell sharpens, and the jar's floor remembers what weight feels like. You lean near the spout, not because looking improves anything, but because you prefer to be present when a better thing happens. A droplet trembles on the lip, thinks about falling, and then obeys gravity with admirable discipline. You return to your post before the beam feels ignored. You play the old game of patience. How long before you permit a taste? 10 breaths you decree. You count inwardly, each number a quiet footstep, and then slip a fingertip through the thread long enough to catch a single bead. It rests on your tongue bright and prickly, greener than the grape smelled, then sweet as if a meadow finished a sentence. A ghost of bitterness walks behind, the tidy kind that keeps sweetness from making speeches. Your mouth answers with the smallest nod, disturbing no one. A companion nudges the tally slate toward you, the count chalked in tidy strokes. You add one a short line that greets the others politely and hand the board back. The dog, who has never cared for arithmetic, adjusts its opinion of the flagstones and snores in a different key. The cellar air keeps its gentle cool. You feel it on the sweat at your neck, turning trouble into attention. Outside, someone laughs once. The sound slips through the doorway, tastes the must, and decides to whisper. Now and then the stream hesitates, thins, considers, and thickens again as the cake reorganizes itself under the collar. Such negotiations are part of the house's dialect. You take the pause as a prompt to brush stray skins from the trough wall, to wipe the spout with a damp corner of linen, to touch the folded cloth above for mischief. Everything behaves. The press rewards good manners with flow. You reward flow with jars. Jars reward you by standing where you put them and attempting nothing clever. You crouch to see what the light is doing in the jar's belly. A soft column builds where the thread lands. Tiny galaxies form and collapse in a domestic eternity. You find yourself breathing at the rhythm of the drip, an old trick the press uses to persuade shoulders and jaw to leave their arguments at the door. Overhead, the timber croons to itself, and the screw writes the same patient sentence it wrote in your grandparents' year. and meant every time. A helper brings a small sieve. Not because you doubt the cloth, but because the sieve likes to feel useful. You balance it across the jar, lifting and setting it aside as the stream changes its mind about seeds. When the sieve catches nothing for 3 whole breaths, you hang it from its nail and restore the linen to sole responsibility. It accepts the honor with humility and the lingering scent of soap that never entirely learned to leave. You step to the row of filled jars and tip one just enough to study the surface. It smiles back, a faint swirl, a delicate haze that will settle when it gets over itself. The glaze throws light like watered silk. Your thumb finds the old nick on the rim, an honest flaw you greet every vintage. On the floor, the stain map remembers other years and busy hands. You could trace a family tree from the places where must decided to have opinions. The bar calls you another quarter turn, then a rest, then another. The stream answers with gratitude, then with modesty. You take what it gives and do not scold. When a jar nears its habit of fullness, you lift with your knees and not your back, because wisdom and vertebrae are fond of each other. The line along the wall lengthens, the room gaining company of the amiable kind that smells like summer, deciding to take its coat off very slowly. By late morning, the first jars wear their linen caps like small monks at prayer. A fly tries the same joke twice and is shown the door without comment. The slate's number grows to the sort that would satisfy even an anxious steward. You rinse your fingers in the bucket and shake them dry over your boots. Water and leather have made peace for centuries. The must on your skin returns as a phantom sweetness that lives near the wrist and refuses to be talked out of it. You make another check before you allow yourself a second taste. The spout is clean, the trough nearly innocent, the cloth above quiet, the beam as sensible as ever. The new bead on your tongue is rounder now, less green, as if the cake had appointed a spokesman who learned a gentler voice. You let the flavor sit until it finishes its thought, then swallow and let your breath go out like a corridor that forgot the draft. Stillness follows, not empty, but full of orderly intentions. The jars line the wall like a low choir, each one humming its particular note of sweetness. The press murmurs as the screw settles a finger's width and then stops. You set the next empty by the spout and listen to the tiny applause begin again. Work continues, because work is the surest lullaby here. Lift, place, cover, note. Lift, place, cover, note. The day lengthens as quietly as a shadow learning the floor's patience. Historically, cellar workers in 17th century Burgundy caught the first free running must directly from the press spout in ceramic or small wooden vessels, and often kept those earliest jars separate as the finest portion. A quirky cellar habit occasionally noted was to crown a full jar with clean linen and a short vine sprig or herb, a domestic coronation said to keep the must modest. Historians still argue how consistently growers at this date distinguished and labeled free run versus later pressings, and whether practices differed markedly between estates or were simply taught by habit and memory. You settle into the day's long circle as if the capstan were a clock and your arms its patient hands. The bar offers the same familiar weight as yesterday, not heavy so much as opinionated. You step, you breathe, you push. The beam answers with a low wooden yes that nobody finds surprising. Across from you, another pair of hands matches your slow cadence, the two of you meeting and parting at the corners like old neighbors sharing a path. The flagstones remember every footstep, and the screw writes its quiet sentence, letter by letter, downward through the collar. Creak becomes music when it repeats. The press house collects that tune beam, collar, rope, the modest patter of must, and blends it with the softer sounds that wander in from the vineyard. A thrush tries 3 notes and decides that is enough art for the morning. A cart complains once and is forgiven. A breeze edits the doorway and leaves the punctuation of dust motes. You keep the circle small and steady. The bar insists on politeness and gets it. You trade the turning the way people trade chairs at a crowded table. One more slice, then you shift. Your partner takes the weight. You take the jars. The rhythm continues, as if the two of you were one person with 2 sets of shoulders. You slide a brimming jar aside, set a clean one under the spout, lower the linen like a quiet flag, and mark the slate. Someone murmurs the number, perhaps you, perhaps them, and the slate accepts it without applause. The dog observes none of this and achieves a masterpiece of sleeping. Between turns, the cake settles with its own small grammar. You ease the screw a finger's width so the skins can breathe. Then tighten until the bar says, "There, that will do." The stream brightens, grows modest again, then brightens once more, a narrow river whose manners you've taught carefully. You do not scold it for hesitations. You give it time and it gives you must, which is the oldest bargain in the cellar. You make a second bargain with your shoulders. You will keep them square and they will keep their complaints to themselves. The hours learn to walk in a loop. The bar goes round. The jars line the wall. The light in the doorway moves from the stones to the jars, from the jars to the beam, from the beam to the quiet of your sleeves. You taste once in a while a single drop, as proof that patience is not just a rumor. Early brightness softens less meadow, more fruit the bitterness stepping back, as if it has other tasks. You nod to it and leave it to its settling. Laughter arrives in fragments and leaves politely. Someone remarks on a knot in the beam that looks like a sleepy eye. Someone else declares the press is less stubborn today because yesterday you remembered to flatter it. These are the jokes the press house allows, being a stern but not unkind place. You reply that the beam loves attention and the screw prefers results, which is unfair to the beam and perfectly true of the screw. The room approves by ignoring you completely. The bar moves on. Now and again you rest your hands on the wood and count a quiet 10 while the cake rearranges itself. You listen with your fingers more than your ears. The faint shift inside the cage, the subdued softening that means skins are learning to be reasonable. The cloth holds its line. The collar holds its authority. The trough holds a new constellation of drops. When you turn again, the bar greets your shoulder like a door that has remembered its hinges. The screw descends a hair. The flow admits that it can be generous without being showy. Outside, the sun abandons its shyness and warms the tiles. Inside, the cool holds. You feel the border of those two opinions on your forearms when you pass from doorway to bar and back again. A helper brings in clean baskets for the afternoon's load and stacks them with a tidy geometry that makes a room breathe easier. You accept a dipper of water, and it accepts the purple map your fingers have been drawing on themselves. The faint metallic tang from the bucket rings and disappears into the musk-sweeter air. You and your partner switch places again and again until switching becomes invisible. One of you keeps the beam obedient. The other keeps the jars honest. The slate grows numbers as evenly spaced as fence posts. When a jar needs a moment to settle its foam, you wait the space of 3 breaths and then cap it, because impatience looks foolish in a house that outlives everyone in it. When a seed clings to the spout, a damp cloth persuades it to seek a more meaningful career. When the cloth above shows a wayward crease, a knuckle smooths it back to reason. The press's rhythm pulls your thoughts into its circle. Lists unwind and fade. Worries try to enter and give up. Your own breath becomes a metronome that prefers not to be noticed. You measure the day in quarter turns, and in the small glassy bells of droplets landing in jars. If anyone asked what time it is, you would answer, "Nearly another jar," which would be correct enough for present purposes. The dog agrees by snoring on the beat. At midday, you allow a longer pause. The bar rests in its sockets. The cake sighs. The stream dwindles to a polite whisper that continues even when you pretend you have stopped listening. You sit on the low step, bread in one hand, a small wedge of cheese in the other, and nothing in your mouth that competes with must. Salt is acceptable. Garlic is not invited. The air smells of grapes that have decided to become something else and are content about it. You were thinking of a story. The story has decided to wait. When the break ends, the bar welcomes your shoulder as if no time has passed. It is a patient friend, the kind that expects you to show up and doesn't particularly care what else you have been doing. The afternoon moves in the same circle, but slightly slower, as all afternoons do. The jars fill and line up like monks with modest ambitions. The screw sings lower. The beam answers. The trough performs its small, clear labor, and the chalk dust from the slate gathers on fingertips already crowded with stains. By now, you could turn the press with your eyes closed, and sometimes you nearly do. Your feet know the honest places on the stone. Your hands know when the grain under the bar warms enough to ask for a brief rest. You learn the personalities of this cake. as you learn the personalities of the vines at dawn. Which corner complains first? Which fold in the cloth wants to rehearse drama? Which small creak belongs to happiness and which to caution? Nothing today chooses caution. Everything chooses work. Late birds fuss in the hedges and argue good-naturedly about the merits of afternoon. A cloud passes. The doorway dims. The jars on the wall turn from amber to pewter and back again. The must keeps to its business. You give the bar another measured quarter turn, and the stream thickens, then relaxes to a steady thread. More jars join the choir. The line along the wall becomes a kind of low architecture, a gentle colonnade you will carry to the cellar when the light decides to leave. You end the hour as you began it, hands on wood, breath even, attention wide but unexcited. The room's small society continues without asking your permission, flies making brief and regrettable decisions, water settling in the bucket, a broom reminding itself it will be needed later. You smooth the cloth above the cake the way a parent smooths the hair of a drowsy child, and check the wedges for the satisfaction of finding them already proper. Then you turn again, because that is what you are here to do. Historically, crews in 17th century Burgundy took turns at the capstan, alternating labor between turning and tending jars, with paced pauses that let the press cake relax and the must run more freely. A quirky cellar habit, sometimes reported, was to match footfalls to birdsong, or a soft chant, so the turning stayed even part rhythm, part entertainment. Historians still argue whether such routines were deliberately taught across estates, or simply grew from local habit and memory passed along between seasons. You let the bar rest where it is, and permit your shoulders to remember they are not part of the beam. The stream continues without you, a quiet ribbon that makes its own case for patience. You step into the shade that the roof has bargained from the sun. Old wood breathes wine and smoke. Stone returns a stored cool that climbs from your boots and persuades the back to soften. You rinse your hands in the bucket. Thin violet ghosts unwind from your fingers and fade. Drops fall to the flags and vanish as if embarrassed to be seen. Sticky remains, loyal as ever. You accept the badge and wipe your palms on the house linen that lives on the beam. A little stain returns to the cloth, which seems pleased to have been consulted. Bread comes from a fold of cloth yesterday's heel, with good manners. You press the crust, break the loaf, and breathe the calm smell of grain. A thumb of cheese follows, salted just enough to turn water into reward. You eat unhurriedly. Hurry belongs to the screw, not the mouth. The dog agrees by sleeping louder. An argument no one troubles to answer. The jar beneath the spout reaches its notion of fullness. Foam makes a low crown and breaks itself neatly. You exchange jar for jar, lower a square of linen, and add another quiet citizen to the line along the wall. Stone behind them keeps its cool. Glaze gathers a little light and gives it back as if remembering some other afternoon. Now you ask the spout for a single drop. It gathers, hesitates, and lets go into your palm. On the tongue, it is frank. Bright where sun met skin. Sweet where the year did its work. A polite bitterness from stems that promise to learn restraint by evening. You keep the flavor until it finishes its thought, then allow it to leave. Outside, silver has become gold. Leaves turn their pale sides when the breeze edits them. A cart tries one complaint and moves on. Far off, laughter decides it has already earned its wage. The press house keeps its own weather. Cool sits on the neck like a sensible hand. You sit on the low sill and set your boots in a patch of sun. Leather warms, toes forgive. Dust performs a small procession in the bright lane through the doorway. Your breath lengthens and forgets to report. Hands open and stay open. A neighbor worker discovers a fig in a pocket not meant for figs and offers it with a shrug. You accept. The skin sighs, the seeds whisper, and sugar declares a quiet holiday. The press clears its throat in timber. The stream thins, then gathers. You replace the jar without standing, because thrift and indolence find they are cousins after all. The slate receives another mark, with the chalk held like a knife you are not using. Later you will write it properly. For now, the number knows what it is. Your forearms, no longer carved from duty, flirt with idleness. You indulge them and give the screw a courteous quarter turn. Oak answers in a low voice. The cake inside the collar rearranges its case. The ribbon of must fattens, and then behaves. You return to the shade before ambition sets traps. Valor is not a grape variety you cultivate. A narrow pane of sky shows between tiles and predicts an obedient afternoon. The room's scent has shifted. Less leaf, more fruit, less talk of vines, more of jars. You rinse your palms once more. The water resumes its quiet. The ladle hangs from its nail like a weight that measures thirst instead of time. A wasp visits to audit standards. You watch it with the benevolence due to small officials. It writes a figure in the air, fails to stamp it, and departs without damages. You snug the linen on a brimming jar, and let that be the victory you keep. Small, needless adjustments hold the day together. Crumbs go to the charitable corner that is always slightly hungry. The corner accepts and, satisfied, stops being dramatic. You stand. Joints remark upon their existence with tidy clicks. Your fingers smooth the cloth at the collar, though it needs no smoothing. Habit is the least expensive luxury the cellar provides. For a minute you do nothing important. You lean, you look, you listen. The beam murmurs, the screw thinks, the trough counts with drops instead of numbers. A bird tries 3 notes and publishes none. Shade holds, cool keeps. Idleness, asked to define itself, declines politely and returns to work. When the minute ends, you declare the lull complete. A clean jar takes the spout just as the stream decides to be generous again. You meet your partner at the capstan. One nod writes the whole treaty of cooperation. The bar turns. The beam consents. Your breath falls into the old count and finds it still fits. You tie the rag back on its nail and glance along the row of jars. Their brown-green shoulders glow like a modest choir. The press house smells fully of fruit now, the patient kind, not the noisy kind. You gather the last crumbs into your palm and offer them to the day as a tithe. No one objects. A shadow crosses the doorway and moves on. Your hands return to the bar. Grain recognizes you. Whatever heat the sun is hoarding for later, the cellar has already borrowed for now. Shoulders accept their appointment. The screw resumes its slow argument. The jar answers in its single language. Rest has done its duty. Work remembers its manners. Historically, midday respite at the press was customary in 17th century Burgundy, with workers taking bread, cheese, and water, while the free run must continue to drip under light pressure. A quirky tidbit from Cellar Talk describes tasting a single drop to hear what the sun has to say. A small ritual mixing courtesy with superstition. Historians still argue whether such pauses were set by steward's rules across estates or simply followed each cellar's own rhythm. You ease the bar back a fraction and let the press keep breathing on its own. The stream quiets to a thoughtful thread, then a disciplined drip. This is the moment for small orderliness. You draw the brimming jar away with both hands, set it among its cousins, and turn to the work that keeps juice and skins in the polite relationship they deserve. The trough waits, a shallow riverbed with a patient lip, and the damp cloth you saved for this hour hangs from its nail like a modest flag. You fetch the sieve and lay it across a low tub, its rim nicked where other seasons remembered themselves. A ladle, heavy in the hand, dips beneath the spout to catch what comes with more ambition than clarity bright, must braided with skins that believe they were invited. The sieve receives it without judgment. You tip your wrist just enough to let the liquid glide through, leaving behind a small congregation of violet curls and pale seeds that look like calm punctuation. You clear the sieve with a gentle shake, the way one might encourage crumbs from a tablecloth, and set the gathered skins on a flat board. They shine dark silk, with a breath of bloom still clinging, then dull as air introduces them to the next part of their usefulness. Another ladle, another pour, another promise kept. When the flow becomes pure again, you set the ladle aside and let the thread fall straight into a clean jar, the linen cap waiting like an old custom that still earns its place. The cake under the collar gives a whisper of surrender. You answer with a small, respectful tightening, no more than a quarter turn. The beam replies in its lower register. More must rises to the spout, brighter now, as if the cake has decided to cooperate, without being reminded of its obligations. You tend the sieve again, never hurrying, because speed forgets details, and this entire house stands on details no one remembers aloud. On the board, the skins gather into a shallow hill, stems like little footpaths in a town map. You touch the pile with your palm to feel its temperature cool with cellar air at the edges, warmer where the press found the fruit's own weather. You lift a handful and let it fall. It lands softly, a hush of little leather leaves. You think of soil and sun, and the ordinary persistence that taught vines to do this without asking for speeches. A helper brings a wicker basket lined with cloth, for the skins already pressed beyond ambition. Together you tip the board and guide the heap into the basket, steady as a baker with a slow loaf. The stems lie crosswise, pretending to be architecture. Loose seeds roll toward the cloth and stop, like modest guests. You tuck the corners of the lining over the top, and set the basket aside where a patch of floor has decided to be useful. Back at the trough, a few errant skins have clung to the stone as if hoping for a better offer. You sweep them gently toward the sieve with 2 fingers and the damp edge of linen. The spout clears its throat. The stream improves its manners. You lift the fresh jar closer so the thread does not gossip against the lip. Then breathe out and let the work reduce itself to breathing and listening. The press prefers workers who know how to disappear without leaving. You take a moment to skim the thin foam from a jar that queued up with opinions. It peels away like the quiet rind on warm milk, revealing a clear face beneath. The skim goes to the basket with the skins. Waste is a word the cellar rarely uses. You taste a droplet from the jar's bare surface, less leaf now, more fruit, less talk of stems, more of sunlight. And then you remember to say nothing, as if praise would make it shy. Outside, light has become a more confident guest in the doorway. Inside, the stone keeps its temper, and the room holds steady. Your hands learn again the clean triangle of tasks. Tend the spout, calm the sieve, shepherd the skins. The chalk on the slate grows toward an afternoon certainty. Somewhere behind you, a broom remembers an opinion, but says it later. The dog turns once in its sleep, confirms that the earth is still the earth, and resumes its contribution. You rest the bar for a breath, then grant the screw a courteous nudge. The cloth above tightens, the collar clears its conscience, and the cake settles by the width of a fingernail. The stream becomes a graceful ribbon, a shade darker than morning's. You move the filled jars to a cooler corner and lay their linen cap smooth so nothing feels neglected. Order is a kind of kindness, and the must responds to kindness by not making trouble. The skins now hold less shine and more story. You pull aside a few that remain too plump and return them to the sieve for one last conversation with gravity. The rest you companion into a second-line basket, the calm, modest remains of a labor done properly. Later they will find their peace, where peace is found for such things. For now they stand with dignity beside the wall, exhaling a faint perfume that remembers everything and insists on nothing. As the hour lengthens, you find the rhythm easier than thinking. Latli, sieve, har, bar, beam, breath, cloth, collar, calm. The trough's lip glows with a thin belt of damp, and the spout writes its line upon the day with a steadiness that belongs to oak, stone, and habit. You tend each part without asking for novelty. The cellar is allergic to novelty unless it has learned to be boring in the right way. Historically, cellar crews in 17th century Burgundy strained must from the press to separate larger skins and seeds before moving the juice to casks, often setting aside the heavier pomace, marc, for later uses, or a second pressing. A quirky habit sometimes noted was reading weather in the heap of skins workers, saying a glossy mound promised a polite ferment, while a dull one asked for patience, a superstition kept because it cost nothing. Historians still argue how uniformly estates managed marc at this date, whether secondary pressings and pomace handling followed common practice across villages, or varied by grape, house custom, and the kind of wine intended. You carry the first brimming jar to the waiting barrel, the way you would carry a sleepy child, close, steady, with a promise that nothing unpleasant will happen on the short journey. The barrel rests on 2 wooden cradles, belly tilted toward the bung where a copper funnel sits with well-behaved confidence. Oak gives a shy perfume, a little vanilla from old seasons, a little toast from the cooper's fire, much quiet wood minding its own business. You test the funnel seat with a small twist that says, Do not improvise. Then pour a slow ribbon of must. Sound becomes narrow thunder below hollow, and round while bubbles gather at the copper lip and pop like discreet applause. One hand steadies the jar, the other holds the funnel's ear, because gravity is talented but not always discreet. When the jar empties, you set it by the rinse bucket. A helper passes the next without ceremony. Jar to funnel, funnel to belly, belly to depth, the procession. You listen more than you look. Down in the barrel, the must lands with soft astonishment, rebounds, and settles into whatever shape liquid uses for discipline. A thin sweetness leans out of the bung, as if to greet the air, and then withdraws to get on with its duties. You run your palm along the hoops. Iron bands cool under the hand, one a little sulky and asking for half a tap. The mallet advises. The hoop remembers courage. The stave line relaxes into obedience. At the third jar, a shy drip forms under the bung. Pride is admirable. Stickiness on oak is not. A folded scrap of linen persuades the droplet to retire. You roll the barrel an inch to feel for grudges at the crows. None today. The staves have swollen into one another like neighbors after rain. A second barrel waits same shape, different scars. Its head bears the cooper's stamp, 2 small marks, and a flourish from a day when someone liked their work. You thumb the bevel and feel last year's chalk still in the grain. Later, you will write the date and parcel again. For now, you prefer the sound of filling, which is comfort disguised as task. The helper brings a hoop driver, and, because optimism is useful, a small bucket for leaks. When a new barrel takes its turn, you give it water first. A few ladles to wake the wood and test intentions. It sheds the rinse with dignity. No threads appear under the hoops. The seams keep their vows. The must follows, confident now. You pluck a floating skin from the funnel like a leaf from a guest's sleeve. Inside, the pitch changes as the level rises deeper, then echoing. You slow the pour and listen for the timbre of nearly enough. You stop before the barrel says, please. A clean bung cloth rests across the hole while the foam remembers its manners. You tickle a bubble with a rye straw. It collapses like a boast that met a ledger. The helper lifts an empty jar. You accept a full one. The room's time becomes the distance between 2 brims. Another barrel prefers to be courted. Its crows mutters. The hoop driver sighs. A wedge lifts the belly, and the note improves. A thin leak presents itself at a joint like a bad idea. The helper slips a shaving of reed into the seam with a wet knife, and the leak repents. You pour again, because forgiveness is part of the craft. The funnel hums. The barrel answers. The cellar keeps a straight face about the conversation. A breeze edits the doorway and revises the scent. Oak louder for a minute. Must quieter. Stone indifferent as ever. You lay a damp cloth over the funnel between pours, so flies choose an honorable retirement. Trust grows in the easy trade of tasks your hands. Their hands, one rhythm. The first barrel nears its proper pride. You lift the funnel, wait for the surface to settle, and leave a modest headspace so the business to come will not feel crowded. The bung cloth returns for a brief rest. The wooden bung waits on a stool like a polite guest not yet invited to sit. 2 more barrels drink in turn, then a third that prefers questions before answers. You oblige with patience. You stand back to let the scene be itself. Bellies on cradles, jars dwindling to a sensible few, chalk waiting on the sill, bung cloths breathing quietly, the bucket keeping its improbable importance. Your forearms report where jar handles believe themselves to be rope. The ache is tidy and therefore trustworthy. Between pours, you trace the cooper's rings and read the wood's history with your fingertips. Fire taught the stave to bend. Grain learned to agree. A nick remembers an enthusiastic apprentice. You roll the barrel a finger's width to be sure the cradles love it. They do. The cellar offers a low, cool patience that climbs your sleeves and settles your shoulders. Now the last jars of this run go where they are wanted. The funnel is rinsed and hung from its nail, shining in a modest way. Bung cloths fold into squares, the size of your palm, and wait by the holes like courteous thoughts. You chalk a small sign on the head parcel. Day, your initial, because memory needs help, and chalk enjoys being useful. The rinse finds the floor and becomes history. You listen once more for the pitch of enough, then stop. A final pass for order. Hoops honest, staves quiet, cloths clean, bung ready. You do not set the bung yet. You let the must breathe like a guest granted a moment at the threshold. The room smells of fruit and oak in a truce. Your hands rest on the barrel head, and the oak answers with the smallest thud, a polite acknowledgement from one worker to another. Historically, 17th-century Burgundian cellars commonly filled oak barrels, often pieces of roughly 200 to 230 liters, for fermentation or storage, swelling staves with water, and testing hoop tightness before adding must. A quirky tidbit from cellar lore mentions leaving a clean bung cloth loosely over the hole for a short while, so the new juice could greet the air politely before the bung was set. Historians still argue whether primary fermentation mostly occurred in open vats or in barrels, and how widely sulfur wicks were used. You fetch the broom that leans in its usual corner, its straw ends ruffled from last year's opinions, and begin with the floor that remembers everything. The stones are a map of small disasters' purple stains that turned honest, pale arcs where water dried, a darker crescent beneath the spout where the morning insisted on being generous. Your first strokes are slow so the dust will learn your intentions. Skins and stems slide before the broom in a soft tide, whispering against the flags like paper, deciding not to be important. You keep the sweep broad and steady, starting at the far wall, and drawing the mess toward the door in long lanes. Where juice has painted the stones and become glue, you scatter a thin veil of clean sand and give it a minute to think. Grit teaches stickiness, the value of humility. The room smells fully of grapes now ripe and mild, pleasantly tired. A wasp considers its prospects and is shown out with a quiet hand. The dog opens an eye, approves of civil order, and returns to the philosophy of sleep. The broom finds what hands missed, a shy stem hiding by a peg, a curl of skin lodged in the crack between two stones, the blue dust of bloom that turns your knuckles ghostly when you brush it. You tip the pan, and the day's leavings heap themselves into a modest hill violet, green, a few seeds that clink like tiny coins. These are the scraps of useful work, and they look harmless now that the press has taken their bragging rights. You trade broom for bucket. The water you drew at dawn still holds a thin chill. A pinch of ash rubbed between your palms turns it soft and a little slippery, the poor cousin of soap that the cellar trusts. You wet the floor where sand has argued with must, then kneel with a rag that began life as a shirt and has made its peace with this career. The rag moves in circles that grow into bigger circles until a shine appears that does not need to be proud about it. Under the press you go, careful of the beam's sensible shadow. The trough slip gets a devoted wiping. The spout receives a thoughtful finger so that no stubborn droplet will write its memoir after you turn your back. You lift the slatted cage an inch, enough to persuade a few last skins to abandon their siege. They sigh into the pan. The collar keeps its authority. The folded cloth, set aside, wears a faint purple edge like a ribbon earned without theatrics. You turn to the tools. The mallet bears a ring of pale dust where it kissed wedges all morning. You brush it off with your sleeve, then pass a damp cloth along the handle until the grain stops protesting. The capstan bars get the same courtesy, each end wiped, each middle smoothed, their dents counted without comment. The sieve and ladle, you rinse in a low tub. Seeds skitter away, shells glint and vanish, and the water darkens to a polite rose that goes quietly to the drain. Jars next. The empty ones line up for inspection, each rim checked by thumb, each belly tilted to be certain no shy seed has elected residency. Those that pass the spout today you rinse and set mouth down to steam away a little pride. A neat line of linen squares hangs from a cord by the doorway, catching a thread of sunlight and pretending to be flags of small, well-run countries. You refold the caps that deserve it, corners align like sober promises. The baskets that brought fruit earlier have their say. You shake them out over a clean board, no drama. Just a few last stems that thought themselves indispensable. The wicker hums when you brush it with the palm of your hand. Dust loosens. A strand that forgot its duty is tucked back where it belongs. You set the baskets to rest on their sides, so air will find the places where juice tried to make friends. Everything in the room prefers to dry before it is asked to behave. The press base gets your last attention. You pour a dipper of warm water along the edge where sweetness collected, and invite the bristles to remember they are bristles. The stain lifts enough to count as progress. Not enough to pretend last year did not happen. That is the seller's idea of honesty. You straighten and feel the small chorus of joints that approve of being consulted. The dog changes arrangements on the floor to suggest it has always been lying exactly where it lies now. Order creeps outward like calm. Skins tied into their cloth bundles wait by the wall. The filled jars breathe under their caps. Quiet is bred before it remembers the oven. The barrels drowse on their cradles with the patient weight of beasts that have chosen to stand still. The doorway frames a slice of sky and the suggestion of vines beyond it, idling between green and gold. You rinse the rag, wring it until it thinks better of ambition, and hang it on its nail to dream of further usefulness. You step back to where the day began and regard the room as if you just walked in. Corners are corners again. The spout has nothing to say. The beam owns its shadow. Your hands smell of lye and a stubborn sweetness that does not surrender to water, only to time. Your boots lift clean from the stones without argument. You could press again at once, but the room teaches the next lesson. A tidy pause makes better work than a hurried turn. A companion appears with a shallow pan of warm water scented faintly with rosemary. You dip the linen caps, wring, and snap them straight, not to make them grand, but to remind them they belong to orderly labor. The air fogs for a breath, then clears. You drape the cloths in pairs over the cord so edges meet like neighbors with good boundaries. The pan's surface shows a thin rainbow where must has negotiated with ash. You pour it at the threshold, so the dust will learn humility before guests do. The last sweep is for corners and conscience. You kneel to coax a ragged berry from a crack, not because it matters much, but because it will matter later if ignored. The broom stands beside you, bristles up, a little flag of truce while it waits, because the room prefers tools that rest awake rather than sleep untidily. You touch the wedge that most enjoys being loose and give it a warning tap. It pretends surprise, then behaves. The slate receives a small note house set to rights, which is less for memory than for manners. You open the door wide and let the light draft through, then close it to a modest gap so the room keeps its cool. The sand you used goes back to its jar, patient as ever. The rag returns to its nail. The bucket retires to the corner like a veteran who neither boasts nor apologizes. You run your palm once along the beam in a straight line and feel the wood answer with a calm, low thrum. Clean is not a perfume here. It is an attitude. Historically, press houses and cellars in 17th century Burgundy were swept with straw or twig brooms, with clean sand or straw scattered over sticky patches, so the floor could be worked before rinsing with water or weak lye from wood ash. Tools and vessels were likewise washed with hot water and ash solutions to keep the must from turning sour. A quirky habit sometimes noted among workers was to rest the broom with its bristles up so it won't learn laziness, or to tuck a sprig of rosemary into the bristles to sweeten the air while they worked. Historians still argue how rigorous daily washing truly was across estates, whether thorough rinsing and ash lye scrubbing happened after every pressing or only at day's end, and to what extent cellars already relied on sulfur matches to sweeten casks during this century. Est apartments from the warm square near the threshold to the cooler patch by the beam, and resumes its excellent contribution to morale. Now the collar. You lift it together, easing it over the folded cloth. Each ear finds its peg with the satisfaction of an old joke told well. A dowel dreams of being loose. The mallet explains the world in 2 courteous taps. You run your finger around the rim and feel the same story everywhere. Snug, level, willing. Above, the great screw watches with the impassive patience of oak born to argue slowly. A breath of tallow rubbed along the threads remembers yesterday's lesson and promises to keep the turn civil. Jars next. The wall shows gaps where earlier arrivals marched off to the barrels. Fresh soldiers stand ready in 2 neat files, shoulders brown, green, and steady. Each jar already wears a folded square of linen, waiting to become a cap the moment a job is complete. The chalk slate has been wiped with a wet thumb and leans nearby, eager for a new genealogy of numbers. The copper funnel on its nail gleams as if it has prepared a speech. You encourage it to practice silence. Before the turning, you complete the small rituals that keep afternoons obedient. Capstan bars are pulled, turned once in your hands, and set within easy reach. The remaining fruit on the table receives a damp cloth, so skins will not get ideas about sun. The sieve is checked for an impatient seed. Waste stems go in a pan and out the door to the hens, who applaud in their brisk way, and then apply themselves to quality control. You stand for a breath and allow your shoulders to lower, as if someone else has remembered to carry them for you. The first tightening is scarcely a tightening at all, only a statement, a hello to the screw, and a promise to the cake. The beam gives a low, sensible sound. The collar clears its throat. The fruit inside breathes once, considers, and settles, as if it has recalled its upbringing. You leave the bar as it is and return to the table to prepare the next baskets. Rhythm restarts without fanfare. Pour, spread, smooth. Pour, spread, smooth. Cloth edges fold into crisp triangles. The collar bears itself like furniture with opinions. The lattice reminds juice to find paths instead of arguments. Beyond the doorway, the sun argues for the honor of owning the hour. Dust performs a quiet dance, and then forgets its choreography. Inside, stone keeps its cool treaty. You taste the air. Less leaf now, more fruit. Less water, more sun. A small smile is permitted. This is the cellar's version of applause, and no one notices, which is perfect. A neighbor worker brings a shallow bowl of brine and sets it by your elbow. For the threads, they say, in the tone of a proverb. You brush the cloth's rim lightly. The fibers lie down and promise humility. The bowl returns to the shelf with the solemnity of a household saint. The cloth behaves. The press rewards virtue by refusing to complain. Another load is ready. Cage lined, stems crossed, fruit layered, collar true, bars at hand, jars assembled, slate expectant. You lay your palms on the beam, the way a reader taps a book before opening it again. Oak answers with a low note that could be imagination or agreement. You decide not to find out which. Some mysteries are happiest when they are not chased. A breeze finally remembers you and threads through the doorway. It finds the sweat at your neck and turns it into comfort. You nod to the weather for its late professionalism, then take the bar and meet your companion's glance. The circle begins. Shoulders, grain, patient weight. The first drop pretends to be shy and then becomes honest, falling neatly into the waiting jar. You place the linen square nearby, as if it were a promise in cloth form. The stream steadies. You turn, pause, listen, adjust, breathe, continue. Between turns, you return to the table, build another quiet hill of fruit, and keep the cloth over what waits. Overhead, two swallows count laps between the rafters as though paid by the circuit. Their shadows pass over your hands and continue on to more important matters. When the jar is full, you cap it and set it among its cousins. The wall learns a new shoulder and pretends it always knew it. The spout thins to a thread. You offer the screw a modest quarter of persuasion. The ribbon grows confident again. The trough's lip gains a wet shine that looks like a rule. You wipe it anyway, because rules like reminders. A single seed attempts to cling. The sieve corrects its career choice. The slate receives a mark. Another jar joins the row. The day lengthens without declaring it. You glance at the barrel cradles where the morning's must has begun the faintest fizz, more rumor than ferment. You acknowledge the future with a nod and return to the present, because the present is shy and wanders off when ignored. The afternoon settles into that style of work where nothing new happens and everything important gets done. The beam owns its shadow. The cloth lies smooth. The cake learns manners the slow way that makes manners stick. You taste one droplet from the ribbon, less green now, more fruit, and a small stone note that seems to remember where the vines keep their feet. You answer with the briefest nod, the cellar's highest approval, and let the flavor complete its sentence before swallowing. Then you turn again, because that is the agreement here. Turn, pause, listen, adjust, breathe, continue. Afternoon obliges by behaving like a long, patient hand. Historically, presses in 17th century Burgundy often ran multiple charges through the day, with workers staging new fruit in the cool of the press house, while midday heat made long vineyard trips unwise. Hemp or linen cloth commonly lined the cage and capped jars to keep insects and grit from the must. A quirky tidbit from cellar habit describes brushing a little brine on cloth edges to teach threads humility, a domestic trick borrowed from the kitchen. Historians still argue how methodically estates scheduled afternoon pressings versus simply working by feel, and whether such cloth treatments were standard practice or local custom whispered from one house to another. Afternoon loosens its belt and sits down in the press house like a heavy cat on cool flagstones. Sun pushes at the doorway and stops, held by stone and habit. Your shirt chooses places to cling. Your back replies with a polite note that requires no answer. You roll your shoulders, once small arithmetic, to keep them from filing louder opinions later. The bar behaves as in morning, only slower because you are slower, and wood is generous enough to pretend it matches you. Palms know every dent along the grain. They travel the circle on memory alone. Each quarter turn arrives with a pause for listening in case the cake reconsiders, the collar wants flattery, or the spout has improved its diction. Heat and cool meet on your forearms, where sun and cellar argue through cloth. Hat brim low near the door, lifted again in shade. Breath lengthens, steps shorten. The ribbon of must stays serene, and jars line up like a choir that knows one song. You add a mark to the slate. Chalk leaves a pale grit, proof that numbers have bodies too. Your partner mirrors you with different jokes. When shoulders trade for jars, words shrink. All right, you say? All right, they say back. A dipper of water passes like a treaty. The dog opens one eye to confirm the universe is unchanged, then resumes research into snoring against stone. You taste less often now, not from boredom, but because the must has settled on an answer and repeats it kindly. Early green softens to patient fruit. A seam of bitter stays on duty where stems carry opinions into the jar. You trust time to teach humility and the cellar to make time behave. The spout keeps its commentary short. The trough reduces argument to a polite shine. Between turns, you stretch the way sensible people pay small debts before they grow bold. Hands to beam, heel to flagstone, neck to shade, breath to count. A smear of tallow persuades a proud inch of thread. The screw thanks you by ceasing to act important. The collar sits a hair lower. The cloth above remembers its triangles and stays quiet. You allow the luxury of inventory without offense. Baskets, stacked. Sorting knife, where it belongs. Sieve, clean as an honest window. Linen caps, a row of calm flags. Barrels, breathing, not boasting. Jars, afternoon's neat architecture. One wasp rehearses its thesis and is shown the door before the conclusion wanders. The doorway trades bright for brighter. Inside, air keeps a cool voice. The next tightening goes in halves a step, a heartbeat. The other step. The stream thickens, then remembers composure. You move the brimming jar aside with two careful hands and let the empty cousin take its place. A domestic waltz the press has seen enough times to stop watching. A linen cap drops neatly, smoothed by the back of your fingers, because smoothing what you cannot control is an old human hobby. Outside, vines throw small sparks where sun catches a tear of juice. Inside, a droplet gathers on the lip, considers theater, chooses obedience. You accept the compliment. The slate earns another mark. The chalk breaks and becomes two pieces convinced they are independent. You introduce them and return both to the sill. Fatigue is an honest foreman. It does not shout, it points. You accept its guidance. Shorter strides at the capstan, longer breaths by the jars, more listening than turning. Your partner copies you without asking, and the afternoon finds a rhythm that respects reality. The dog slides into a newer patch of shade and wins a draft of cool air, as if by contract. You think of the vines left in early light leaves that began silver, turned green. Grapes insisting on weight, rose like rivers running downhill. The memory walks through the press house and sits quietly. You let it stay. The beam keeps its slow grammar. The screw pursues its patient verb. Your hands conjugate labor in the present tense. More jars join the wall knees together, caps modest, shoulders brown-green in the doorway's bright language. You carry them two at a time to the cool corner where barrels wait, like civil beasts. The copper funnel glints but holds its tongue. Its hour returns when sun tires of its performance. For now the spout alone speaks, and it speaks respectfully. You take the afternoon's small generosities shade widening. A stray breeze remembering to pass through. Stone lending its stored night. You work inside those gifts without announcing them. The trough is wiped before it asks. The sieve is rinsed before it sulks. The cloth is straightened before it invents drama. Prevention is quieter than repair, and quiet is the house style. Another quarter turn, then a rest, another jar, then a cap, another mark on the slate, then a glance at the barrels. Ferment has not yet spoken, but if you lean near the bung cloth, you can almost hear tomorrow rehearsing. You step back from temptation and return to today. The cake requests a breath. You grant it. The screw answers with a sigh you do not need translated. A helper arrives with a plate that used to be a plate and is now a tray of sliced pears. You take one. It tastes like water that remembered to be sweet. You share another with your partner without words. Juice on your fingers meets juice in the jar and makes a point that needs no debate. You rinse your hands and return to the bar, which pretends it missed you. By late afternoon, the press house looks like a task that will finish when it decides, not when you declare it. You respect that governance. The beam owns its shadow. The floor keeps sand where it helps. The jars gather like a low hedge along the wall. You make no new noises. The old ones are sufficient. Creak, drip, step, breath, chalk. Historically, workers in 17th century Burgundy slowed their pace in the hottest hours, keeping gentler turns at the capstan, so must and bodies stayed cool while gravity did its share. A quirky habit sometimes noted was rubbing a touch of tallow on a stubborn patch of screw thread so it remembers manners, often paired with a murmured compliment to the beam. Historians still argue whether such heat management routines were formal cellar rules or simply local habits passed by memory from shoulder to shoulder. You trade the bar for a jar and a length of easy breath, and the press house remembers it is a room again, and not only a machine. Your partner slides a brimming shoulder of brown-green glaze into the neat line by the wall and stands beside you for a moment, the two of you admiring nothing in particular, as if it were a small fire. "All right," you say, which here can mean praise, complaint, or weather. "All right," they answer, which is the correct reply to everything that does not need fixing. Words in this room wear plain clothes and do their work without drawing attention to themselves. Talk begins the way ivy begins, quietly, with no intention of stopping. It does not arrive as news, but as nonsense with good manners. Someone remarks that the knot in the beam looks like a sleepy eye. Someone else taps the wood as if waking an old friend who never truly sleeps. A small laugh crosses the floor in soft shoes and is gone. The dog twitches one ear to record that minute and returns to the doctrine of sleep. You cap the new jar, smoothing the linen until the square remembers it is a square. Your partner adds a mark to the slate, more for the comfort of counting than for surprise. You change places at the capstan, and the circle gives your voices a tempo. The bar turns. A sentence lengthens. Your words ride on the wooden yes that the beam keeps repeating. You offer the old story about a season when the press refused to behave until someone hummed into the screw. Your partner counters with the tale of a barrel that stopped leaking the moment it was christened Father. These are poor stories, and therefore durable. They have been told softly enough times to be sanded smooth, with no edge left to catch on the day. Behind you, two helpers sort fruit for the next charge. Their conversation is a kind of music. Leaf away. Stem behave. This one later. The sieve answers with a tidy clink. The ladle counts measures. The basket creaks the way a chair admits age. A wasp holds a brief meeting near the doorway and adjourns without minutes. The trough keeps a modest shine. The spout writes a narrow sentence of must. The jar listens politely. A smile visits your mouth, and moves along cheer is welcome here only if it knows how to work. You grant the cake a breath, and lean on the beam for talk that is not about grapes. How late the moon trod the sky. How one field remembers rain better than another. Who married whom with what measure of luck. Which row has decided to be poetry, and which has decided to be arithmetic. The press house edits every subject down to its quiet parts. Gossip shrinks to kindness, because there is not enough air in here for long speeches. Your partner shares a proverb their grandfather liked. Wine keeps what is whispered and forgets what is shouted. The beam accepts this without comment. Back to the bar, back to the jars. You trade names for the same vine row as if the earth cared what you called it. The south path is old man. The crooked run, cat's spine. The stony bit, coins. Your partner claims coins gives louder berries. You answer that coins only speaks clearly when the year has been honest. Both of you are correct because both of you intend to be. Above, the oak watches with the tolerant patience of trees that outlive disagreement. The screw descends a finger's width. The cloth tightens. The stream fattens, then behaves. A jar nears pride. You draw it down, cap it, and polish one stray drip from its shoulder with your sleeve. Smell? Your partner asks. You nod, and the two of you lean toward the spout like conspirators in a harmless crime. A fingertip beads a taste you could describe 10 ways and choose none. Fruit that has remembered itself. A seam of leaf that knows its place. A small stone word from the soil that insists on speaking. You let verdict take the shape of a breath. Yes, you say. Yes, they echo. The beam approves by not changing its mind. Heat presses its face to the doorway like a curious child. Inside, cool keeps law. You share a swallow of water. The dipper knocks the bucket rim in the note that means we are still here. Your partner shows a purple map on their palm and says, badge of office. You raise your own and say, back pay. The joke does not travel far. It does not need to. Tools bear witness with the polite interest of furniture, and the dog awards you nothing at all, which is the highest honor a dog in a cellar can give. When the next charge is ready, you lift together with the practiced choreography that makes two bodies look like one opinion. The cloth folds in crisp triangles. The collar seats itself with modest authority. The dowel that enjoys drama receives a reminder from the mallet and becomes a citizen again. You observe, purely for the pleasure of saying it, that the press behaves best when flattered. Your partner replies that the press is a saint who only recognizes the liturgy of effort. You concede the sermon with a nod and put your shoulder to the homily. The capstan writes its slow circle, and the stream obeys. Stories return as the screw descends by letters. A storm that bid hard for the grapes and lost. A neighbor who swore by picking under fog. A cooper who learned diplomacy from a hammer after his hoops grew playful. Each tale is low-voiced and carefully stupid, warned to safety by time. Speech here is not for surprise. It is for keeping company with motion. The ribbon fattens, then steadies. The jar waits, receives, breathes under linen. You trade the bar for the slate, then the slate for a jar, and the afternoon arranges itself around those exchanges. You ask after an absent worker whose cough holds too much of his chest. Your partner shrugs in a way that means hope without confidence. A helper remarks that the hens have discovered a theology about stems. You answer that hens are born theologians, arguing creation from whatever falls under their beaks. That earns a soft laugh that finishes before the next drop lands. The laugh is important precisely because it is small, because it takes up no space the press might need for its own sentences. You let the cake rest, then tighten a courteous quarter turn. The beam replies in its low register. When evening begins its rehearsal outside, your talk leans toward supper and tools. Who will fetch bread? Who will rinse the sieve? Who will promise the broom that its hour is coming? There is no debate, just assignments that write themselves on feet that already know where to go. The slate gains another mark. The jar line becomes a frugal wall. The capstan turns while voices thin to silhouettes. What remains between you is not wit, but the knowledge that neither of you will make the work harder than it has to be, which is the real luxury of companionship. The day loosens another notch. You run your palm along the beam. It answers with the low civility of timber that remembers other hands. Your partner tightens a linen cap and pats it the way one settles a child who has just fallen asleep. The hum returns without author and rises to the rafters where swallows kept their ledger earlier. You take the bar. You yield the bar. You trade the same 2 or 3 phrases until they stop being phrases and become a blessing written on labor. The room smells of must and wood in a truce. Nothing insists. Everything agrees to continue. Historically, vineyard and cellar labor in 17th-century Burgundy often mixed family members, hired hands, and seasonal workers who shared tasks, meals, and modest wine rations while pressing and hauling must. A quirky custom sometimes noted was nicknaming rows, presses, or barrels and addressing them like moody neighbors, with low humming or work chants used to keep a steady cadence at the capstan. Historians still argue how commonly women and children took part in pressing itself versus sorting, carrying, and cellar tending. Since practices varied by estate, season, and local habit, You tilt your face toward the doorway and watch slow clouds cross the thin river of sky above the tiles. The light is gentler now, wrapped in a pale gauze that makes even the vines outside seem thoughtful. Inside, the press house keeps its cool grammar: wood, stone, linen, breath. Your hands rest on the capstan bar without turning. The bar smells of tallow and old oak. Your palms have learned its dents like the steps of a familiar prayer. A breeze moves through, tasting of crushed thyme from the path and chalk from the lane, and the skin at your neck decides to forgive the afternoon. Nothing urgent happens. That is the clever part of the hour. The stream at the spout shrinks to well-spaced syllables, clear drops stitching a thin seam of light into the waiting jar. Between drips, you hear the house thinking to itself. A rope fiber adjusting expectations, a wedge easing, the soft tick of a cooling tile. Your breathing learns the interval and lengthens to match. Fatigue, always theatrical, postpones its speech until evening. Clouds hold their small theater, a ram, a sail, a shield. Your partner says the long one looks like a pike. You claim it is a bishop's hat. This disagreement is resolved in the usual way, by refusing to resolve it. Instead, you give the beam a courteous quarter turn, just enough to remind gravity of its duties, and the thread becomes a ribbon again. It lands in the jar without chatter, a white line that frays into tiny stars and disappears. You lift a folded square of linen and set it ready, the cloth smelling faintly of rosemary from the wash. A helper returns from the rows and spills a basket of leaves on the sorting table, the uninvited guests of harvest. They smell of shade and dust, and the small pepper note where a stem snapped. You dip a hand into the basket and stir it like a weather vane. West wind, you think. The clouds have flattened into pages with neat margins. Paper sky promises cool later, and paper sky usually keeps its word. Stone has kept it already. The room's air sits on your shoulders like scents. You take a finger's worth of must and hold it to the doorway's light. It leans toward gold now, the way afternoon leans toward supper. On the tongue, it is rounder than morning, still quick, but no longer eager to prove a point. Stems contribute a polite caution, then step back. You let the taste finish its sentence before swallowing. A swallow, an actual one, cuts a straight line between rafters and leaves, as if signing the hour on your behalf. You and your partner interview the sky the way people do when they prefer not to interview their own thoughts. Rain tonight, you suggest. Dew by dawn, they counter. Wind intends to be important. You both agree, and will probably succeed only where there is dust to impress. The vineyard beyond the doorway flickers silver when a breath of air turns the undersides of the leaves. Farther down the slope, a cart makes one dignified complaint and is forgiven. The jar reaches its pride. You trade it for an empty cousin and crown the full one with linen. The ribbon continues, modest and sure. You test the screw again, half a breath, half a turn. Inside the cage, the cake answers with a soft exhale. The cloth at the top keeps its triangles. The collar keeps its authority. A wasp audits the arrangement, declines to find fault, and goes back to studying the sky for crimes it can actually prosecute. For a minute, you permit idleness and stand where the breeze can find you. The clouds thin to veils. Their shadows slip over the vines like quiet hands smoothing a bed. You measure the hour not by the sun, but by the newly capped shoulders along the wall, by the way the must smell has shifted from leaf to fruit, by the lower key in the beam's voice. The slate's numbers lengthen without fuss. Everything that needs doing is being done by something other than worry. You return to the bar because reverie is hired part-time. The grain greets your palms as if you had never left. Another courteous quarter turn, another slow ribbon, another jar placed, capped, and joined to its comrades. The press behaves so well you almost suspect it of listening to the sky. You decide to flatter both of them equally, which costs nothing and keeps morale tidy. Historically, wine growers in 17th century Burgundy watched the sky closely during harvest, reading cloud forms and wind shifts to judge when to pick and how hard to press, since sudden rain could dilute fruit and mire the paths. A quirky habit sometimes noted was ringing a small handbell or standing a knife upright in the yard to cut the storm, a domestic ritual against hail and temperamental weather. Historians still argue how widespread such anti-hail rites were in this period, and whether local confraternities or parish customs shaped them more than cellar practice. The press finds its voice and keeps it low, even a patient groan that folds itself into the afternoon until you hear it without needing to notice. You stand a little off the capstan and listen, as if the room were reading aloud from a book you already know by heart. Oak speaks in syllables, the beams drawn-out vowel, the collar's short consonant, the screws steady consonants, as thread meets thread. Underneath, the quiet rush at the spout writes its own soft commentary, a silver line becoming a brown-green shoulder in the jar. You ease the bar a quarter turn, and the pitch sinks by the width of a breath. The cake inside the cage answers in tiny rearrangements. You feel more than hear the small settle of skins, the modest resignation of stems that thought they might hold the line and decided not to. You lay a palm on the collar. It is firm and cool and uninterested in argument. A wedge looks at you with its usual mischief. The mallet supplies a sentence it understands. Peace resumes. Sound orders the hour better than any bell. A fast creak means a dry inch of thread. You grant it a thin whisper of tallow, and the creak remembers manners. A quick tick under the cage means a seed tried to become a pebble. The sieve persuades it back to seedhood. A faint slap at the trough lip means the stream has become too proud. You lift the jar closer and pride falls silent. If you close your eyes, the room tells you everything without seeking your consent. Your partner hears the same grammar and replies in kind. One of you turns, one of you tends jars, both of you listen. A fuller voice from the beam? Very well, a pause. A softer thread at the spout? Then the screw may earn another fraction. The jar choir along the wall hums a single note of sweetness, altered only by linen caps that barely breathe. The dog edits the score with sleep and is forgiven for snoring on the beat. You make the small rounds that keep sound honest. Fingers smooth the folded cloth above the cake until the triangles agree to be triangles. The trough lip receives a fresh wipe, and the spout's mouth is cleared of the two skins attempting to found a republic there. A jar takes its place, steadied by one hand while the other hand greets the slate with another mark. The chalk squeaks and stops just enough noise to prove it is working, not enough to claim attention. Outside, a moving shade crosses the doorway cloud, or bird you don't check, which shifts the light, and therefore the sound, because cooler air makes wood more reasonable. You breathe with the press without thinking, long when the bar moves, even when it rests. A helper hums without meaning to, and the beam replies in its key. You drink from the dipper. The bucket answers with the same hollow note the barrel gave earlier, and the cellar keeps its temper. Now the press proves its age without showing it off. The screw descends a finger's width in the space of a story about last year's hail. The beam keeps its oath. The jar fills to pride. You set the cap and touch the linen just once, as if knocking on a door you've already opened, to promise the must a quiet journey to the barrel later. You trade the full jar for an empty cousin and return to your place at the bar. The circle resumes. The sound resumes. Your shoulders make no speeches. They simply agree. You think how much of the craft is learned by ear. The young watch hands. The old listen to wood. The best lesson is the simplest. A good press does not shout when you are doing things properly. It clears its throat. It does not accuse. When it approves, it sings a little lower and lets the must behave like a river that has remembered its bed. Historically, 17th-century Burgundian presses were heavy oak screw presses set on stone beds, their capstans turned in stages by two or more workers who paused between turns so the cake could settle and the must could flow steadily rather than in bursts. A quirky bit of cellar lore held that you could read pressure by pitch some crews, nicknamed a low, contented groan the bull, while a high, fussy squeak was the magpie, a sign to add tallow or patience. Historians still argue how universal this ear-led practice was, and whether lever presses continued beside screw presses longer in some villages than account books suggest, since estate records favor what was owned, not always how it was used day to day. You choose the quietest place by the doorway's pale light, and lift the jar so the ribbon can stitch the surface once, twice, like a seam you intend to hide. You set it down, and take the tasting reed, a narrow length of hollow cane, kept smooth with soap and thumb. One breath draws a thin thread of must. The reed lays it on your tongue without ceremony. You let the flavor cross slowly, heel to toe, until it steps off and leaves a clean print behind. Mouths that hurry only hear the loud parts. At first the taste is meadow bright, a little hedge, a little thistle, and the brief bark note from stems that still feel important. You tilt your head to let the bitterness find its corner and sit there politely. The scent rises sweeter than the taste sun on skins. A shy pear, a whisper of leaf. Your partner watches for the verdict without asking the question. Well, they say at last. Frank, you answer, which is a cellar word that means honest enough to improve. You give the screw a breath's worth of turn. Just the courtesy owed to oak and gravity. The beam replies in a low vowel. The cake inside loosens a knot it pretended not to have. The stream fattens to a modest ribbon, and the smell shifts a half shade toward fruit. 10 heartbeats later, you taste again. Sweetness puts on a little weight. The bitter seam combs its hair. You nod, which here is both approval and instruction. 3 small clay cups line up on the sill, unglazed and patient. You take a drop for each now, then after a pause, then after a quiet quarter turn. You drink them in order as if reading one sentence that corrects itself kindly. First, keen, grass at noon. Second, fruit remembering its tune. Third, a low word of stone, the field speaking from the soles upward. You and your partner share the look that means the day is making sense, and you will not get in its way. A helper brings a pinch of breadcrumbs on a scrap of cloth, the old trick for wiping the mouth between sips. Ridiculous and effective. You take one, let the tongue return to a plain register, and taste again. The little pear-light steps forward, white pepper bows and leaves. None of this goes on the slate. The cellar counts jars, not adjectives. Still, the mouth remembers, and the hands. And between them, the year will not be able to pretend otherwise when barrels begin their talk. You visit 2 jars from morning. Their linen caps lift with a small sigh. The surfaces have calmed to polished amber. You touch each rim with the back of a knuckle and find the cool the stones lend to anything willing to be quiet. A sip from each shows what half a day can do. Edges soften. Sweetness rounds its shoulders. The green seam narrows and minds its manners. You put the reed down and simply breathe near them, which teaches you as much as tasting. Your eyes stray to the barrels drowsing on their cradles. Bung cloths sit like modest caps. Beneath, the faintest sound begins. More rumor than ferment. You look away. Tomorrow will speak loudly enough without being invited. At the spout, the ribbon holds its best posture, neither proud nor shy, and the next taste agrees. A gentle middle, a decent finish, and a small, clean scrape of seed that says, turn, but do not bully. The reed goes back across its nail to dry. A straight line to keep you honest. For the next measure, you taste with a fingertip only. The drop warms on skin and arrives less brightly, which teaches something about vanity and temperature. The lesson is simple. The press is patient, and so must the mouth be. You wipe the finger in the bucket, trade the full jar for an empty cousin, and crown the newcomer's elder with linen. The stream resumes its needlework. The slate receives a mark to stand for a paragraph you will not write. Light thins and begins to leave the doorway. Your partner asks whether the day's juice is ready to be humbled by oak. Nearly, you say, because nearly is the safest adverb in a cellar. You give the screw a final courteous quarter, and then a long pause. The cake exhales. The ribbon holds steady. The room smells of fruit that has decided, without speeches, to become wine if left in peace. You answer the press by not talking, which it appreciates. Historically, tasters in 17th century Burgundy sampled fresh must directly at the press with wooden spoons or hollow reeds, comparing sips taken after pauses or additional turns to judge sweetness, bitterness, and body as pressure increased. A quirky cellar habit kept a pinch of bread to rub across the tongue between tastes, or a drop set on the back of the hand to smell the sun before drinking. Historians still argue how formal these tastings were, whether estates kept notes and rules for free run versus pressed fractions, or relied mostly on memory and the cellar master's palate. You step into the narrow alleys between rows with a shallow basket and a strip of clean cloth, walking where the morning dropped its small opinions. Fallen grapes wait in shy clusters and scattered pearls, some cool with shade, others warmed to surrender. You crouch and roll a berry with your thumb. If it splits like a whisper and smells honest, it earns the cloth. If it wears grit like armor, it goes to the side heap where vinegar and livestock keep their promises. You move slowly, because gravity is a clumsy picker. The ground keeps its catalog: dew, dark soil, a thread of straw, a beetle reconsidering its route. You pinch away a leaf, lift a cluster that mostly behaved until the last second, and brush the dust with the hem of the cloth. A wasp inspects your standards and declines employment. The basket's wicker speaks in small creaks as you add what the row forgot to carry. Each find is a modest rescue. You favor fruit that fell whole and recently, berries whose bloom still dulls the shine, stems not yet brittle with indignation. A cluster with a torn shoulder joins the mark pile later. The sweeter hearts you wrap in cloth, so they will not go speaking to every pebble about texture. Nothing here is heroic. It is housekeeping with better perfume. Your partner joins with another basket, the two of you moving like tidying wind. They point with a chin at a pocket of shade where the vine's elbow bent low. You reach under and coax out 3 clean bunches that landed softly and never learned to complain. You exchange the kind of praise that uses few syllables. Good, good. The dog appears, decides fallen grapes are beneath its dignity, and returns to more important investigations of dust. By the time you reach the end of the row, your basket holds a quiet, useful harvest. Not the story the steward will repeat, but the part the seller respects. You set the cloth over the fruit and carry it like a mild secret back to the press house. There, you give these rescues their own brief sorting clean to the cage. Smudged to the vinegar tub, hopeless to the hens, who treat disappointment as a calling. You pause at the doorway and shake the cloth into the outside light. Dust departs like regret. The breeze finds your neck again and filches a little heat. Gratitude answers without words. You return to the cage and lay the neat gleanings on top where the cloth will fold them gently. The bar waits with the patience of furniture. The screw saves its next opinion for when you ask. Historically, vineyards in 17th-century Burgundy practiced post-harvest grappillage, gleaning, gathering fallen or missed clusters so fruit would not waste, and so poorer neighbors might take a share after the main picking. A quirky local habit noted in some parishes was to ring a small handbell to signal the start of gleaning, after which children raced the rows for the earth's grapes. Historians still argue how uniformly such gleaning rites applied in Burgundy. How much was charity? How much regulated by the bande vendanges? And how strictly estates enforced cleanliness of fallen fruit before it joined the press. You shoulder the first pièce with your partner, easing the round weight onto skids that remember this work. The barrel mutters in oak as it rolls, a hollow note you feel in the palms more than hear in the ear. Step by careful step, you guide it along the ramp to the cellar's cool throat. The air changes at once, stone-cold, yeast-sweet, candle-dim, and your lungs lengthen, as if the darkness were made of rest. Cradles wait in 2 neat ranks. You bump the staves into their wooden hands and test the piece. A press of the heel here, a hush of the hoop there, the small reply of wood that has agreed to belong. The bung cloth lifts. The surface below gleams faintly, the must breathing its light perfume. You leave a modest headspace and set the wooden bung not tight, but courteous, a finger's grace for what will soon wish to speak. Chalk writes a small genealogy on the head parcel. Day, your initial, your partner's, and the mark looks sober against the toasted ring where fire once taught these staves to bend. A shallow tray slides under the crows to catch what youth throws off when it forgets itself. A folded square of linen lies over the bung like a polite hat against gnats and gossip. You listen. Somewhere far corner one barrel ticks in the shy language of beginnings. Another follows. The skids groan. The belly turns. The cradle accepts. You pat the hoop with the flat of your hand, a habit that pretends to be inspection. A reed shaving waits in the knife's mouth, in case a seam decides to remember last year's leak. Not today. Your partner brings a dipper and wets the floor around the ranks, waking the smell of stone the way a rain wakes a road. The cellar replies with a deeper quiet that settles at the back of your throat. You move along the line, setting each bung with the same almost tightness, the same patient cloth, the same chalked courtesy. In the far arch, a spider claims the corner like an abbot. You let it keep its charter. A candle gutters once, and then behaves. When you pause, the room speaks in the smallest ways. A pop like a berry changing its mind, a sigh through the bung hole, the cotton hush of linen moving under a draft. You straighten. The barrels look taller for being believed. At the stair, you taste the air one more time, cool, tart, expectant, and leave the door just shy of shut so the night can do its plain miracles without feeling watched. Back upstairs, you wash the chalk from your fingers and find your palm has kept the circle of the barrel as a ghost. You approve of that, and the approval does not need to be said. Historically, Burgundian pieces of roughly 200 plus liters were racked on wooden cradles in cool, low-ceiling cellars, with bungs set loosely at first to allow the ferment's breath before tightening later. A quirky cellar habit placed shallow pans beneath the crows to catch the barrel's first pride, an overflow kept for kitchen vinegar or steward's notes. Historians still argue how commonly sulfur wicks were burned in empty casks in 17th century Burgundy, and whether primary fermentation more often began in open tubs before being moved to barrels, varying by estate and vintage. Evening begins at the doorway first, a soft dimming that takes the brightness out of dust and replaces it with calm. You feel the air turn toward cool, a shawl the stones lend back after keeping it all day. The press house lowers its voice. Creak becomes murmur. Drip becomes tick. Your breath becomes a metronome that prefers not to be noticed. You lay a final palm on the capstan bar and let the screw sit where it is, the cake inside exhaling by the width of a thought. You walk the short path outside. Vines stand in orderly dusk, their leaves silvering when a breeze flips them like pages. On the slope, pickers stack empty baskets under a hedge. Someone shakes a cloth, and the day's crumbs leap once and are forgiven. The sun folds behind a hill with the practical grace of a lid finding its pot. A bell far off gives a single note that sounds like enough, which suits everybody. Back inside, you make ready for night the way you make ready for work. Slowly, with manners. Jars wear their linen caps straight. The slate's last number dries to a chalk hush. The sieve hangs by its ear. The bucket returns to its corner like a veteran asked to tell no stories. You drape the cloth over the cage and smooth the triangles, not because the fruit can feel it, but because you can. The beam keeps its patient shadow. The dog, wise beyond philosophy, chooses the coolest flagstone and demonstrates contentment as a curriculum. You enroll without paperwork. Supper is bread, a heel of sausage, a few grapes you pretend you are not stealing from tomorrow, and water that has remembered the well. You sit on the low sill and eat without ambition. Talk is small. A row that sulked, a cart that behaved, a nephew who learned the difference between picking and wrestling. Your partner says the press was kind today. You say you were kinder. The argument ends by agreeing with the bread. Lanterns arrive, the tallow kind that smoke a little and make the rafters look thoughtful. You hang one by the doorway and one over the trough. Small suns with modest opinions. Their light turns the room to amber and gives every jar a faint halo, which they endure bravely. You listen for the cellar's reply from below. A pop here, a sigh there, the smallest fizz where tomorrow is already practicing. Historically, workdays during the 17th century Burgundy harvest commonly ended at dusk, with crews tidying tools and covering press cakes before the evening meal. Lanterns or tallow candles were used sparingly in press houses to avoid heat and soot. A quirky local habit sometimes mentioned was leaving a single grape on a window ledge for the vineyard saint, or tapping the beam twice to thank it before shutting the door. Historians still argue whether estates enforced strict dusk curfews versus allowing night pressing by lantern when yields were heavy, a practice tied to local bylaws, the ban des vendanges, and worries over theft and fire. You fetch the wash bucket and pour from the kettle until steam puts a thin veil over the rim. Ash from last night's hearth goes in by pinches. You stir with a stick until the water learns a faint slipperiness. The scent is wood smoke and something clean. Your hands purple to the knuckles. Map lines of juice along the wrists go first. Heat pulls the day from your skin. Stickiness loosens. The pale bloom under your nails admits defeat. You work a scrap of linen between fingers, over the pads where the capstan's grain has left its small sermon. The ache that pretended to be important becomes a memory with good manners. Tools line up for their turn. The hooked knife gets a rinse, then a rub along the cloth, edge away, as if you were lulling it towards sleep. The sieve lowers into the tub and returns speckled. A swirl clears the seeds, and your thumb persuades a last skin from the mesh like a polite eviction. The ladle dips and drains until it stops blushing. Capstan bars receive a wipe down along the shiny path palms made, followed by a dry rub so the grain does not sulk. The dowel that enjoys drama gets special attention mallet dust brushed off, end checked for bruised pride. You lift the cloth that lined the cage and study its purple border. Rinse, ring triangles hang straight on the cord, dripping in even syllables. The trough's lip is scrubbed with a twist of linen. The spout's mouth is wiped until it forgets to be sticky. A square of sand scatters across the worst stain on the flags. The broom bristles careful. Handle steady explains humility in long strokes. Water follows and leaves the honest gloss this room understands. You tip the bucket at the doorway. The pour darkens dust, then finds the path downhill and minds its own business. Your fingers feel like themselves again, if a little thinner. You rub a dab of tallow into the screw's threads with a cloth, not too much, just enough to teach tomorrow to behave. The bar holes get a spin of the brush so grit will not pretend to be strength. You hang the rag on its nail. It drips in a tidy line, a small metronome that agrees with your breath. The dog checks the corner for lost bread, finds only order, and approves by sleeping harder. A final inventory, jars capped and straight, slate wiped to a gray hush, baskets turned on their sides to dry with dignity, funnel shining on its hook, broom resting upright, as if alertness might be catching. You cup water in your hands one last time and let it fall. A brief rain in a house that likes rules. The press keeps its shadow. The room smells of ash, damp linen, and the last sweetness of must that refuses to leave entirely. You pull the door a finger's width, and the evening fits in that gap like a ribbon. Historically, 17th century Burgundian, press houses wash tools and vessels with hot water and weak lye from wood ash, then dried cloths and staves thoroughly to discourage souring. Brushes or twists of linen were used to clear spouts and sieves. A quirky habit in some cellars was rubbing crushed grape skins over chapped hands as a vintner's salve, said to soften skin and keep luck from washing off. Historians still argue how strict daily sanitation truly was, whether every pressing ended with full ashlie scrubs and drying, or if many estates relied on a lighter rinse and the next day's work to sweeten the wood, especially before sulfur became common. You sit on the threshold where stone meets dirt, and let your spine learn the shape of the doorframe. The vineyard has traded glitter for hush. Leaves speak in small pages, and the rows look pleased with themselves without boasting. Your palms remember the capstan's grain even when empty. When you rub thumb to finger, a faint stickiness answers like a friend who refuses to stop visiting. You allow yourself the brief arrogance of stillness and discover it is only gratitude wearing better shoes. Accounting drifts through your head, the kind that uses pictures instead of numbers. The morning's pale thread of must, the noon ribbon that grew patient, the jar choir lined along the wall like brown-green monks with linen hoods, a seed that tried to be a proverb and failed, a wedge that rehearsed rebellion and then behaved after a two-word sermon from the mallet. You count these as calm triumphs, which is the exact size of triumphs the press house permits. Your partner settles beside you with the silence of someone trained by long work. The two of you share a crust and a soft pair. Neither item files a complaint. You trade 3 words, good fruit, today. Good hands, too, and call that a speech. Somewhere below, the cellar clears its throat with a pop like a distant berry. Tomorrow is writing its first line. You decline to read ahead. You look down at your hands. A map of thin cuts, purple rivers, islands of clean where water was ambitious. A thumb that smells faintly of time because time insists. These are not the hands of saints. They are the hands of presses and jars and modest tools that like being used properly. Fatigue taps the door and is let in. Pride knocks and is told to try again later. Valor, as you have learned, is not a grape variety, and drama does not age well in oak. The day has been plain, and therefore generous. Wood kept its oath, stone remained sensible, cloth remembered its corners, and must chose to be must, without asking for applause. You think of the vines at dawn, the jars at noon, the barrels at dusk, and feel the steady line they draw through your chest, like a cord that ties breath to work and work to sleep. You rise because rising is the last task worth doing today, and because the dog has already demonstrated how to end a chapter with authority. Historically, seasonal crews in 17th century Burgundy ended harvest days with simple food and quiet rest near the press or cellar, often sharing a small ration of last year's wine and bread before sleep. A quirky tidbit in some villages was the habit of rubbing a cut clove of garlic on hands to chase sourness after washing, half remedy, half superstition. Historians still argue whether estates routinely granted nightly wine rations to all workers or reserved them for household staff and hired men, with gleaners and children given only bread and soup. You sit with the others on low stools, pulled close to a plank set on 2 crates, a table because the day declares it won. Bread arrives first, heels and middles. Yesterday's courage sliced into shareable quiet. A wheel of cheese thinks about crumbling and then obliges. Someone saws it with a wire, and the rind speaks in a tidy sigh. A crock of pickled onions makes a brief speech of vinegar and sits down. The tin cups wait. The small jug of last year's wine respects their patience by not hurrying. You break bread with the side of your hand and offer halves without ceremony. Salt passes like news. Brief, useful, unexcited. A knife rests between you and your partner. Whoever needs it takes it. Whoever does not, talks. Talk is not ambitious weather that behaved, rose that complained, a boot that learned humility in a rut. The day's stickiness lives faintly on everyone's fingers. No one apologizes. You raise your cup and sip the modest red, berry turned honest, a thin seam of earth, a memory of smoke from last autumn's stove. A pot of beans arrives wearing time and good intentions. Spoons travel, bowls return empty, and the pot looks pleased with itself in a humble way. Someone cracks a joke about the press being kinder than the steward. The steward, absent and therefore protected, wins the laugh anyway. You cut an apple in 4 with the hooked knife. Juice runs a civil line across your thumb and brightens the smell of the room. The dog receives a crust for services rendered in the field of sleep, and accepts without promising reform. Lantern light thickens the edges of everything and gives faces a patient varnish. You look around the circle and see purple maps on palms, linen creases on sleeves, the calm of mouths that have finished proving their case. Outside, night gathers its loose threads. Inside, quiet tightens its weave. You feel the press house settle 1 notch lower, the way a book page sinks under a paperweight and becomes part of the lesson. You pour a thimble more wine and hold it like a small vote of confidence. No toasts, only a small to the work, which is not a toast so much as a receipt. Fatigue proposes a bed. You accept the motion, if not yet the destination. Someone begins humming the tune the capstan likes. The room answers by refusing to disagree. You fold the breadcloth, not the cheese in its muslin, and let the table return to being just 2 crates and a board, dignified even after demotion. Historically, harvest suppers in 17th century Burgundy were simple. Bread, cheese, beans or soup, onions, and a modest pour of last year's wine, shared by household and hired hands near the press or in the yard. A quirky note in some villages mentions rubbing a cut onion on the knife before slicing cheese, so the steward thinks it's sharper, a domestic mischief with no measurable effect. Historians still argue how generous nightly wine rations were, whether a set measure was guaranteed to all workers or varied by estate, status, and the year's success. You make a small census of tomorrow, because tomorrow behaves better when it has been counted. The press rests with its cloth folded like a good thought. You start with baskets, each one turned on its side so air can finish teaching wicker the lesson of dryness. Your palm runs along rims and catches splinters before they remember to be rude. A frayed hoop is bound with a twist of reed and a grunt that passes for patience. Knives come next. You lay the hooked blade on the board and draw a whetstone down it in short, whispering strokes edge away as if sanding down the day's noise. The point becomes honest rather than proud. You test it on a stem and approve when the cut feels like a sentence ending at the right place. Cloths are shaken, refolded into obedient triangles, and stacked where the press prefers to find them. The mallet gets a dab of tallow at the neck so it will not squeak philosophy each time it makes a point. Ropes earn your attention. You pass them hand to hand, checking for the soft places that pretend to be strong. A few strands are spliced, a knot renewed, a loop taught to remember its job. Capstan bars are rubbed with a rag until the grain says yes without becoming slippery enough to plot. Pegs are counted. Wedges tapped into a small chorus on the sill. Each gives back the sturdy note that means it will not audition surprises tomorrow. The ledger appears, then thinks better of ambition. You write only what the slate will forget by sunrise. Jars to fill, barrels to nurse. A reminder to bring extra cloth for the sieve because the vineyard has opinions about dust. Your partner adds a line that simply says water, as if the world might otherwise forget that trick. The line earns agreement from the dog, who thumps a tail once and retires from governance. Outside, night arranges itself into clean pages. Stars choose their places with the modest confidence of workers who know their task. You step into the lane and listen to the vineyard breathe. Somewhere, a late cart writes a wooden sentence down the road and ends it with a decent period. You lift 3 stray baskets from the hedge, because uncollected baskets become theories, and theories never help with grapes. Back inside, you stage the first hour. Empty jars in 2 ranks by the trough, the sieve on its hook, the funnel shining on its nail, the tally slate propped like a quiet promise. A dipper rests in the bucket mouth down, so dust cannot compose a manifesto overnight. You leave the door on the cellar's latch so cool, can walk up and look around. The house answers with a faint pop from below tomorrow's opening argument, rehearsing under a bung cloth. You end as you begin palm on beam, a straight stroke that says thank you without embarrassing anyone. Then you put out the lantern with a careful breath and give the darkness the last word. It uses it well. Historically, crews in 17th century Burgundy prepared tools at day's end mending wicker, honing knives, checking ropes and pegs, so the next pressing began without delays. A quirky habit in some press houses was tapping each wedge and bar in turn like a goodnight roll call, said to keep tools from wandering, a joke barely pretending not to be superstition. Historians still argue how formal this staging was, whether ledgers listed tasks or memory and habit governed most evenings. Night takes the vineyard in both hands and sets it down gently. You walk the path between rows with an unlit lantern on your arm, not because you need fire, but because a handle gives the hands something to agree with. Moonlight turns the leaves to thin silver coins. Each breath arrives cool and tastes faintly of damp straw and chalk. Far off, a dog considers the usefulness of barking and decides against it. The presses sleep. The barrels dream their round dreams. Your boots learn the soft grammar of dust that no longer pretends to be important. You pause where the slope opens, and the vines make their evening bow to the stars. Dew claims the first stakes, beating on hemp ties like a line of quiet beads. You lay a palm on a post and feel stored heat leave its ribs in a single patient sigh. The world is mostly a list here. Rows, stakes, wire, leaf, earth, sky. And you are one more item, patiently itemized. A bat writes a swift cursive above the lane. A moth performs concern and then forgets. Everything is slow enough to seem wise. You move again, counting absent noises, the cart that is not groaning, the hammer that is not persuading, the scold of a wasp that has chosen sleep. Between rows, fallen grapes hold little moons on their skins. You turn one fruit with a fingertip and set it back where gravity wants it. Mercy, tonight, is letting objects keep their opinions. The press house stands ahead, with its door on a quiet latch, a square of darkness that somehow looks companionable. At the threshold, you listen for the cellar's smallest speech. There it is, a pop like a seed remembering, a sigh that could be a story, but decides to be a breath. You answer with nothing, which is the politest reply. Lantern still unlit. You step inside, feel the cooler air rest on your skin like a sensible blessing, and then step out again to let the night finish its work without supervision. The moon has taken the trouble to be round. The least you can do is not argue. You give the rows a last look, as if they might have changed while your back was turned, which they have not. Leaves whisper once, the way pages whisper when a book closes, and the breeze signs the corner with time and river. You keep the lantern's handle and not the flame, and walk back along the lane that points toward sleep. Historically, vineyard plots in 17th century Burgundy were often watched at night during harvest weeks to deter theft and animals, with simple shutters or latches left on press houses and cellar doors to keep cool air while discouraging visitors. A quirky rural habit in some parishes set a broom across the threshold to trip mischief, or hung a sprig of hawthorn by the door against bad night air. Historians still argue how organized nocturnal watches truly were, whether small holdings relied on family rotation in dogs, or whether communal guards were appointed by village bylaw during the bain de vendange. You descend the cellar steps with a lantern cupped low, though the flame is more company than necessity. Cool gathers around your ankles and climbs your sleeves, the kind of calm that persuades thoughts to sit down. The ranks of pièces breathe in their cradles, each belly a quiet hill with a cotton cap. You bend near a bung cloth and hear it, a thread of fizz, a faint ticking, the first soft bustle of yeast beginning its work. The barrel answers in small syllables, pop, sigh, hush, as if telling itself a story too gentle to share aloud. You lift the cloth and let the lantern find the surface. A modest foam has raised a border, not proud, only certain. You keep the bung loose by a finger's grace and rest the cloth again, smoothing corners until they behave. Along the row, the air changes by degrees. Here, apple, sweet, there pear and river stone. Farther on, the thin tang of heat that ferment invents for itself. You wet the flagstones with a dipper, so the cellar smells like rain. The room approves by deepening a note you feel in your ribs. You test for mischief. A faint weep at one crow's dries with a reed shaving. A sulky hoop remembers its duty after a tap. The shallow pans under the bellies hold nothing dramatic, only a touch of pride at two barrels that forgot themselves for a moment. You write a small mark in chalk on each head. Awake. It is not a sentence, only a witness. Your partner comes down and stands perfectly still, the better to hear the cellar's grammar. Listen, you say, and then neither of you speaks. The sound collects, a low meadow of breaths, the smallest river under wood. You leave with the door pulled to a near close so cool can keep its kingdom, and the yeast can speak without being overheard. Historically, early fermentation in 17th century Burgundy often began in barrel with bung cloths left loose so gas could escape, workers checking foam, leaks, and hoop tightness by lantern light in cool, low cellars. A quirky habit in some houses was lowering a feather or candle near the bunghole if the flame dimmed or the feather stirred. They said the angels are breathing, a homely test for rising gas. Historians still argue how evenly barrel fermentation was used versus open vats across the states, and how soon bungs were tightened as the ferment found its stride. Sleep comes like a sensible steward and posts you to a narrow bed near the press house wall. You do not so much fall asleep as continue the day with your eyes closed. Capstan turns in slow circles. Jars line up like patient monks. A droplet hangs forever, just before it falls. Your hands, still sticky in memory, hold a bar that weighs nothing and everything. Somewhere below, the cellar speaks in small syllables. Your breath replies in time. Dreams arrive with a helpful lack of plot. Vines stand at dawn, leaves silver, rose the color of pewter. The press waits with its calm grammar. A seed taps the trough and becomes a tiny bell. You take a sip of must and taste, the year walking toward you, neither proud nor shy. Even the dog in your dream sleeps, which is your mind being kind to itself. When clouds cross, they do not promise rain. They practice shade. You turn once in the straw, and the bed makes a map of your shoulder. You turn again, and the map changes without argument. The room smells faintly of lye, oak, and pear peel. You hear a bell very far away, or perhaps only imagine it. The sound folds into the beam's remembered voice and becomes a cradle song. Historically, harvest nights in 17th century Burgundy were short and plain, with workers sleeping near the press or in adjacent lofts to rise before dawn. Families and hired hands often shared straw pallets in outbuildings during the busiest week. A quirky local belief held that a grape leaf under a pillow could bring good weather dreams, or that tying a soft vine tendril around the wrist kept nightmares at bay. Historians still argue when certain harvest night customs took hold in Burgundy, how much belonged to older rural rites, and how much to later confraternity traditions that gathered around St. Vincent and other patrons. Before first light, the vineyard is a breath you can see. You rise, fold your blanket, and step into a world that remembers dew. The press house waits exactly where you left it, which is a kind of mercy. You touch the beam in greeting one long stroke, nothing theatrical, and the room answers with the same patient silence it offers on all competent mornings. A clean cloth goes over the cage. The sieve takes its hook. The jar stands ready under the spout like a calm, open hand. Outside, you fetch the first baskets from the hedge where they slept in shade. Grapes carry the night on their skins. Bloom dulls the shine as if the moon left fingerprints. You sort quickly, kindly, without speeches. Stems make their modest lattice. The collar sits. The bar finds your shoulder. The first measured turn writes the day's opening line. The beam gives its low vowel. A single drop appears as if remembering a promise. You nod. The house nods back by refusing to do anything surprising. The cycle is not a circle so much as a braid. Vine to press, press to jar, jar to barrel, barrel to cellar, cellar to breath. You know your place in it, and ask for no other. A bird pronounces dawn official. The dog accepts tenure. Your partner arrives with the right number of words. Work resumes with the politeness of habit. Historically, Burgundy's harvest days were governed by the Ban des Vendanges, official openings declared by local authority, after which vines were picked from dawn, while press houses ran in steady cycles of sorting, loading, pressing, and racking to cellar. A quirky habit in some cellars was to pour the first finger of the day's free run must onto the stone, for the house, a quiet libation said to keep tools cooperative. Historians still argue how strictly the ban was enforced in smaller holdings, and how uniform the morning routines were from hamlet to hamlet, amid varied presses and household customs. You let the day exhale to a thread. The bar rests where it is, neither asking nor refusing. A jar stands under the spout and gathers what little comes the slowest syllables of sweetness, without troubling the air. Light spreads along the floor like cool water, and stops at the doorway, uncertain whether to enter. You take no position on the matter. You breathe in the room as it is. Oak with a patient memory. Stone that has never hurried. Linen that has learned corners. A handful of tools that prefer being useful to being admired. Outside, the vines lift their leaves into morning like hands deciding how much to pray. Inside, the press house becomes the size of your breathing. Your shoulders notice themselves and then forget again. A square of dust on the sill writes a small calendar no one needs to read. The dog turns once into the cool and demonstrates a perfect compromise between duty and ease. You take a sip from the dipper, just water, and it tastes of the bucket, the well, and something else that is probably steel but feels like kindness. If you listen for it, the cellar speaks from below in the same way it has all night. Pop, sigh, hush. You answer by not answering. A strip of cloth dries into the shape your hand left in it. The broom leans without learning laziness. Far off, a cart says good morning to a rut it knows by name, and receives a reasonable reply. You are not finished. You are never finished. But the work has the good manners to pause between its own sentences, and this is one of those commas, wide enough to sit on. You let your breath widen to fit it. You look at the beam, at the jars, at the door where a square of sky arranges itself into blue, and you approve without improving. The day will proceed. You will help gently. We hope this quiet step into another time has left you feeling rested. If you've enjoyed it, you're welcome to like, share, or leave a gentle note. And if you'd like more slow walks through history, you can subscribe and join us again. End of script. Sweet dreams.